the woman known to history as Empress Matilda was most likely born on the 7th of February 1102 at Sutton Courtenay in Berkshire in southern England. Her father was King Henry I of England. Henry was the youngest of the sons of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 had led an army across the English Channel and began the conquest of England from the Anglo-Saxons and Danes. Henry had claimed the throne following the death of his brother, King William II, also known as William Rufus, 2 years before Matilda was born, the previous king having been killed in a hunting accident which some viewed as suspicious. Matilda was named after her mother, Matilda of Scotland, a daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and his wife, the Anglo-Saxon royal princess Margaret of Wessex. Because of this lineage, Matilda was descended from the Norman kings of England, the Dukes of Normandy, the kings of Scotland, and also the old Anglo-Saxon rulers of England prior to the Norman conquest. She was one of just 2 children resulting from Henry and Matilda's marriage. The other was a boy named William Adelin, who was born a year and a half after Matilda. As a male child, William became heir to the throne at his birth, but should anything happen to him, Matilda would become Henry's heir, though this would be problematic at a time when rulers above all else were expected to be military leaders. Henry also had over 20 children through his mistresses, but these were illegitimate and could not succeed him. Matilda was born into a political world in Western Europe which was much more complex than it is today. The divided nature of the region would have a bearing on her entire life. Matilda's father ruled England, which was already a reasonably centralized, unified kingdom, with growing influence over the Welsh lords to the west, and at least for a temporary period, reasonably good relations with Scotland on account of Henry's marriage to Matilda's mother, who was a Scottish princess. Things were much more complex across the English Channel. Here, Henry and his wider family ruled over the Duchy of Normandy in the north, while also having influence over some other territories, such as the County of Blois, through marriage alliances. There was a King of France here who ruled from Paris, but he in no way controlled territory approximating to the French nation-state today, though lords such as the Dukes of Normandy and the Lords of Anjou were nominally the underlings of the French king and owed him feudal homage. To the east, Germany was similarly divided into dozens of duchies, counties, and principalities, but, as in France, there was a semblance of centralized authority in the shape of the Holy Roman Emperors. At the time of Matilda's birth, Emperor Henry IV was the current Holy Roman Emperor, though from 1098 onwards he had begun to rule in association with his son and heir, the future Emperor Henry V. Though it may have seemed like a distant terrain to her growing up, events in Germany would play a role in Matilda's life from a very young age. We have a number of important medieval chronicles and histories extant for the history of England and Normandy in the 12th century, which are the principal basis for accounts of Matilda's life and reign. There are also sections of numerous chronicles and histories of 12th century Germany, which refer to Matilda in light of her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor between 1114 and 1125. Many of the English chroniclers, including William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, were contemporaries of Matilda and wrote extensively about her life and claims to the English throne. A few of these are positive, though the majority present a negative picture of her, notably the Gesta Stephani, which transliterates as the Acts of Stephen, a text which unsurprisingly enough, given its title, was a partisan account in favour of the claims which Matilda's cousin Stephen had to the English throne. Unfortunately, a biographical history of Matilda's life, which was written by the French bishop and chronicler Arnulf of Lisieux, was lost in the late medieval period, a text which would have shed further information on her life, character, and reigns in Germany, France, and England. There were also numerous histories and treatments of Matilda's claims to the English throne written by Tudor historians in the 16th century, a period in which the rapid succession of Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I in 1553 and 1558 animated Englishmen to reconsider the history, merits, and nature of female monarchy. These chronicles provide a patchy account of Matilda's early life. She was raised around an itinerant court which often moved between England and northern France, with her father and mother residing for periods of time at Westminster near London or at Rouen in Normandy. It was an extensive court, one comprised of lords from England and France, where French was the lingua franca. Although she had only one full brother, Matilda grew up amongst a large brood of nearly 24 illegitimate half-brothers and half-sisters, and numerous first cousins, including the children of her father's sister, Adela, Countess of Blois. She may have received some education and tutoring from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, one of the most learned men in Christendom at the time, prior to his death in 1109. Other monks and bishops would also have tutored the children of the royal court at a time when educational standards in Europe were experiencing a major period of growth, which has led historians in recent times to speak of a 12th century Renaissance, which presaged the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. Matilda's formal education was a truncated one, owing to her position as a political pawn in the politics of Europe. As her father's only legitimate daughter, the issue of who Matilda would marry was always going to be an important one. As early as 1109, there were diplomatic negotiations underway between Matilda's father and Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful figure in Central Europe, for the emperor to potentially marry Matilda one day. Despite the roughly 20-year age difference between them, the overtures could not be ignored from such a prominent figure, and in 1110, when she was just 8 years old, Matilda was sent to Germany as part of a diplomatic mission where the diplomats who accompanied her finalized the negotiations with the emperor. Despite her ludicrously young age, Matilda's father agreed to the betrothal of his daughter to the emperor, and thereafter she was raised for the next 4 years in Western Germany in order to acclimatize her to the German culture and the language of the people she would become empress of in years to come. Even by the standards of medieval Europe, the decision to hold a wedding ceremony in January 1114 at the city of Worms, when Matilda was still a few weeks short of her 12th birthday, while Henry V was at least in his late 20s and perhaps as old as 33 years, was unusual. Typically, marriage ceremonies were not held until the participants were at least 13 or 14 and were deemed to be entering their young adult years by the standards of the time. Matilda would spend just over a decade as the Holy Roman Empress, the most senior royal woman in Germany. It was a tumultuous period in imperial history, as her husband was, in effect, at war with the papacy in Rome for control over northern Italy, a major part of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. Henry V had even been excommunicated with papal sanction in 1112, 2 years before marrying Matilda. In the first years after the marriage, Henry spent much of his time campaigning south into the plain of Lombardy, and after a time Matilda joined him there with her entourage and household staff, at one point in 1117 even heading south towards Rome itself, as the emperor tried to seize the Eternal City. Curiously, despite her young age, Matilda was playing an active role in political affairs by 1116 and 1117, with evidence pointing towards her attending government councils and acting as an unofficial sponsor of political measures that arrived to the imperial court. In 1117, she also claimed the title of Holy Roman Empress, as Henry emerged as the victor of the military clashes in Italy. However, the title was not given the imprimatur of Pope Paschal II, and whether she legally was entitled to call herself Empress, or simply held the more junior imperial title of Queen of the Romans, was a matter debated for years to come. Matilda consistently maintained that she was the Empress Matilda, even long after leaving Germany. In 1118, Matilda's significance in her husband's government was made clear when he himself returned to Germany to quell growing unrest amongst several feudal lords there, and left Matilda in charge of the imperial government south of the Alps in his absence. She played important roles during the years that followed, notably in the resolving of the investitures controversy, a long-running dispute between successive Holy Roman Emperors and popes since 1076, over whether the emperor had the right to appoint archbishops and bishops in the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, or whether the pope had the final say in investing these ecclesiastical offices. The controversy was finally resolved by the Concordat of Worms, agreed upon in 1122 in the German city which bears its name. Matilda played an unofficial diplomatic role in the reaching of the major compromise which gave the emperors and the popes different roles in investing bishops across the empire. The trajectory of Matilda's life was immensely altered by the events of the 25th of November 1120. That evening, Matilda's brother and the heir to the English throne, William Adelin, set off with a large contingent of nobles and courtiers to sail from Barfleur in Normandy across the Channel to England. As well as William Adelin, several of the king's illegitimate children were on board, though Henry himself was not, having already made his own preparations for sailing back to England. The party is believed to have had a lot to drink before boarding the vessel called the White Ship, captained by Thomas Fitzstephen. It did not get far. Not far out into the harbour of Barfleur, the ship struck a submerged rock sticking out of the sea floor and soon began to sink. Of approximately 300 passengers, just one is said to have survived. Amongst those dead was William Adelin. With the death of her brother, the succession was thrown into complete disarray, as the king's only legitimate male heir was now dead. Matilda would subsequently become integral to the debate on the succession to her father. The White Ship incident would lead eventually to civil war and the anarchy in England and Normandy, as Matilda's rightful place in the line of succession was questioned. In the immediate aftermath of the White Ship disaster, there was political turmoil in England and northern France. Henry had lost his only legitimate son and the obvious heir to his dominions. Now there was just Matilda alone amongst his children, who was a legitimate child, born in wedlock, and thus a potential successor. Many might have believed at this juncture that Henry would look outside of his immediate family for a new heir. Two potential candidates were his nephews, the sons of his sister Edela, Theobald, Count of Blois, and his younger brother Stephen. The latter might have been deemed an especially likely heir. Henry had shown immense favour towards Stephen in the 1110s as he was entering his adult years, bestowing extensive lands and feudal honours on him in England and making him the foremost figure in the Alençon region along the southern borders of the Duchy of Normandy. In retrospect, it looks as though Henry had been grooming Stephen as a potential spare heir during these years, should anything befall William Adelin. And yet, when the time came to potentially do so after the White Ship, Henry made it clear that Matilda was now his designated successor. Despite her father's efforts to cement her position as his heir, Matilda was only ever accepted by a minority of those who mattered, the knights and lords of England and northern France, and the senior ecclesiastical figures of the English Church. When the time came that Henry died and a successor had to be crowned, whether Matilda became queen or not would depend on the willingness of these men to honour the king's wishes. Many were reluctant. While England would accept female leaders in the centuries that followed, the issue of a female monarch was considered problematic at a time when the primary duty of a ruler was to lead their feudal lords into battle. This was also the case in France, where traditional law dictated that the position of queen regnant was not permitted, but instead only a queen consort to a king regnant. Aware of these issues, Henry would call his lords together on numerous occasions throughout the 1120s and into the early 1130s to have them swear formal oaths to uphold his plans for the succession. As a backup, he also married for a second time to Adeliza of Louvain in 1121. This marriage, however, would prove even more unsuccessful than his first when it came to producing legitimate children. No children resulted from it, and Matilda would remain Henry's sole legally viable heir. One of the other problems which Matilda's potential succession presented was that she was an absentee heir. Back in 1114, she had married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. While this was a politically important marriage to one of the most powerful figures in Europe at that time, it also meant that she was living in Germany and other parts of Central Europe in the early 1120s, even as Henry was trying to convince his lords to accept her as his heir. In an age before any form of mass media, such as printing, having a physical presence in one's dominions was extremely important. It was why kings and queens regularly went on journeys around their kingdoms in order to be seen in the flesh and reassert their authority to their subjects. Matilda's absence in Germany was doubly difficult because of this. After all, the lords of England really had no idea who they were being asked to swear oaths to in the early 1120s. Perhaps Matilda was a strong, poised woman who could make a good ruler one day. On the other hand, perhaps she was the direct opposite of this, a weak-willed, insignificant person who could not be respected as a potential heir. The point was that nobody could be sure, and this made Henry's task all the more difficult. In the end, the English king's son-in-law, Emperor Henry V, resolved this problem by dying prematurely in May 1125 of some form of cancer while campaigning in the Low Countries. He and Matilda had no surviving children, though, as noted, a child had been born years earlier but died in infancy. The imperial title thus passed to Lothair of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony. Freed from her marriage bonds and with no children or family tying her to Germany, Matilda returned home to England in 1126. There, her father's knights and lords would have had their first sustained impression of the woman who Henry wanted to rule over them one day. They should have been reassured to some extent. Matilda was a poised, capable woman, one who might not have been able to lead them into battle in the traditional sense, but who many would have believed could make a good queen. Still, others could never be convinced of the plausibility of a female monarch, and others were disillusioned more broadly with high levels of taxation which the king was imposing and which deepened their opposition to his succession plans. After a spell in England, Matilda crossed the English Channel and took up residence in Normandy. Here she continued to style herself as Empress Matilda despite the death of her husband, the Emperor, in 1125, an affectation which subsequent chroniclers and historians were happy to continue, and Matilda remains known to history as Empress Matilda to this day. In France, her father soon arranged another marriage for her. This time, the proposed groom was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son and heir of the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. The counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine were sizable feudal lordships which lay to the south of Normandy, north of the county of Poitou, and to the west of Paris. They covered a substantial proportion of north-central France, and so Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey was, at least on the surface, an astute move, which ensured Matilda would have financial and military backing if she had to fight for her crown after Henry died. Yet the marriage was problematic in other ways. Geoffrey was still 10 weeks shy of his 15th birthday when they married on the 17th of June 1128, and once he succeeded as Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine the following year, he soon developed a reputation for heavy-handedness which aroused the animosity of some of the more minor lords of Normandy to the north. This alienated some further potential supporters of Matilda, though in the end the resources which Anjou was able to bring to bear after Henry's death were crucial in keeping Matilda's hopes of claiming the throne alive. The late 1120s and early 1130s were difficult years for Matilda. Much of this was brought about by the ongoing issues concerning the succession. By this time, Matilda's first cousin, Stephen of Blois, was emerging as a clear rival. Back in 1125, around the time Matilda's first husband died and she began preparing to return to England, Stephen had married Matilda of Boulogne, who had just succeeded as Countess of Boulogne. This made Stephen lord of one of the foremost polities of northern France, one which lay right on the coast of the English Channel, as well as further lands in Kent in southeast England, further strengthening his position. Meanwhile, Matilda's marriage was troubled, and within a year of it Matilda decided to leave Anjou and went to live in Normandy. A reconciliation was arrived at in 1131. However, the entire situation had irked Matilda's father, who believed she was letting her personal feelings get in the way of the need to find a lasting political solution to the succession crisis. The last years of Henry's life witnessed a steady decline in the relationship between king and daughter, though he never indicated any shift in his thinking on the succession. That Henry was steadfast in his determination to have Matilda succeed him was, perhaps, the result of the events of 1133. That spring, Matilda gave birth to her first child, a relief after a long and largely childless marriage to Emperor Henry V, and several years of marriage to Geoffrey without an heir there either. Born on the 5th of March 1133 at Le Mans, The boy was named Henry by his parents after his grandfather the king, a pointed statement to Matilda's father and the political realm at large that Matilda now had an heir of her own, and if she did become queen in succession to her father, it would be an interim reign of sorts in preparation for the eventual accession of another King Henry one day. The king was elated, and the birth led him to cross to Normandy to see his grandchild. A reconciliation seemed to have been effected between he and Matilda. It was short-lived, though. A year later, Matilda gave birth to another son, this one named Geoffrey. The birth was difficult, and it seemed that Matilda would die at one point, leading to a new dispute with her father about the terms of Matilda's own will and her proposed burial place. Thus, the rapprochement between father and daughter did not last long. Matilda's father died on the 1st of December 1135 while in Normandy. Even though he was around 67 years of age at the time, he had been campaigning in northern France against a rebellion of some of the lords of Normandy at the time of his death. Though the king had never flinched from supporting Matilda as his successor, his daughter and son-in-law were offering some support to the rebel lords at the time of Henry's death. The king's death was rumoured to be due to eating too many lampreys, a kind of fish. Perhaps some form of food poisoning was involved, although his death at such an advanced age could also have just as easily been from natural causes. As the news spread, it became evident that Henry's lords and knights did not all intend on supporting Matilda's claim to succeed him. Instead, many began scheming immediately. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's first cousin, quickly seized the initiative. Within a week of the king's death, he was in England and gathering support from senior church figures and nobles. Then he gained the acclamation of the people of London, and finally was crowned as King Stephen I at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death. Stephen had managed to secure the crown in breach of the wishes of Henry I, in large part because of propitious timing and positioning. When news of the old king's death began to spread, Stephen was not far away from Normandy in Boulogne and was best placed to cross quickly to England. The same could not be said of his brother, Theobald of Blois, another potential candidate for the throne. Similarly, Matilda was further south in Anjou and barely had time to react before news arrived that Stephen had been crowned at Westminster in England. Another reason why Matilda was able to do little to prevent Stephen from seizing the crown was that she was pregnant again when her father died, and in mid-1136 would give birth to her third and final son, William. Each of her sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William, would be known to contemporaries and for centuries to come by the names Henry Fitz-Empress, Geoffrey Fitz-Empress, and William Fitz-Empress. Fitz meaning son of, and Empress referring to Matilda's decision to continue using this title long after the death of her first husband. Matilda and Geoffrey did not immediately commence a war with Stephen to try to reclaim the throne for Matilda. They simply were not in a strong enough position to do so. Instead, they would wait a few years, slowly gathering allies and preparing militarily and financially for the coming war. What tipped their hand and what led to the outbreak of the civil war known as the Anarchy was when numerous powerful lords of England signalled their support for Matilda's cause and opposition to Stephen in 1137 and 1138. The most prominent was Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate half-brother of Matilda's, whom Henry I had promoted to become an earl and to hold extensive lands in England. From Stephen's first arrival in England in December 1135, he had indicated his reticence to accept his cousin as the new monarch, attempting to block his coronation. He was joined in now throwing his backing behind Matilda by Ranulph of Chester, another powerful English earl with considerable land and support in the northwest of the country. Matilda also gained the support, for a time, of King David of Scotland, who hoped to gain further lands along the border through his involvement in the Civil War. The anarchy began when Robert of Gloucester rebelled in 1138. The following year, Matilda arrived to England at the head of an army from France. Over the next few years, the conflict would develop, with Matilda, Geoffrey, Gloucester, and their other allies holding much of the West Midlands and West Country for Matilda's cause and establishing the port city of Bristol as their base of operations, while Stephen retained control over London, the surrounding home counties, and East Anglia. Most of the fighting in the anarchy would play out in the Midlands and regions like Oxfordshire, which lay between Bristol and London. In the war which followed, Matilda most certainly lost the PR campaign. While the German chroniclers who wrote about her time as the wife of Emperor Henry V between 1114 and 1125 were generally favourable towards her, as were many French writers, in general Matilda was perceived badly by the English chroniclers and historians. They viewed her as a foreign upstart who was married to the much reviled Count of Anjou. Why this was the case is not entirely clear. Stephen, who was portrayed much more sympathetically by chroniclers like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, was hardly an Englishman himself, having been born in France, hailing from Blois, and being Count of Boulogne in northern France prior to seizing the throne of England. Conversely, he had spent periods of time in England since the mid-1110s and had extensive estates there, whereas Matilda, though born in England, had always been a distant figure in Germany, Italy, and France. Stephen also appears to have been more humble, whereas English commentators were at pains to stress Matilda's proud and often overbearing nature, something which led one writer to refer to her even in her later years as being of a tyrannical disposition. All of this was evinced in her insistence on being termed Empress Matilda. Unquestionably, the most consequential events of the anarchy, other than those that brought it to an end many years later, occurred in 1141. Early that year, Stephen was laying siege to Lincoln Castle when Robert of Gloucester marched with several hundred knights and a large contingent of Welsh allies to relieve the siege. The Battle of Lincoln ensued on the 2nd of February 1141 after Gloucester and his forces arrived. It was a decisive defeat for Stephen, one in which he was abandoned by many of his allies under pressure from Gloucester's forces. Stephen and his own entourage became surrounded in the midst of the melee, and despite their efforts to fight their way out, Stephen was captured by Gloucester's forces. Now a prisoner, he was taken west towards Bristol, where Matilda ordered his imprisonment in Bristol Castle. This incredible victory left Matilda seemingly victorious, though Stephen's cause was not defeated. No sooner did word arrive to London and Westminster of the king's capture than his wife, confusingly also named Matilda, began gathering forces to strike back against the Empress and to keep Stephen's cause alive. The brief war of the two Matildas which would follow would soon lead to another major shift in the military and political landscape. All of that lay in the months ahead. In the immediate term, Matilda had won a major victory over Stephen and had her great adversary in captivity. She now moved to claim her birthright and fulfill her father's wishes for the succession by becoming ruler of England. And yet, there was a peculiar aspect to this. Although Matilda generally used the title of Empress, and she was now aspiring to become Queen, she did not adopt either of these titles, instead issuing royal charters and grants under the title of Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English. In early April, she and her followers, along with some leading figures of the English Church that she had won over to her cause, arrived to Winchester, home of one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in Europe and a very important centre of the medieval English Church. There, Matilda was made queen in a makeshift ceremony. However, a subsequent campaign to try and seize London failed, and Matilda gained neither the acclamation of the people of the capital, nor was she crowned at Westminster. This was despite winning over Geoffrey de Mandeville, who controlled the Tower of London at the time, yet when Matilda advanced to try and enter London, the inhabitants indicated their clear unwillingness to allow her entry. Somewhat surprisingly, she did have the agreement of Stephen himself, who told some of his supporters to agree to the coronation of Matilda, perhaps fearing that he would be murdered at Bristol if he did not. Nevertheless, many people continued to view Matilda's coronation as entirely illegitimate. Matilda did not have long to enjoy her success. The other Matilda, Stephen's wife, Matilda of Boulogne, had gathered sufficient forces by this time that she was able to begin campaigning into the Midlands with the aid of her brother-in-law, Henry, Bishop of Winchester, and William of Ypres, a lord of the Low Countries who had brought mercenary troops to England to aid Stephen. On the 14th of September, they descended on Winchester and thoroughly routed the forces which were gathered there in support of Matilda. The rout of Winchester was significant in that Robert of Gloucester was also captured during the fighting. With her foremost ally and half-brother now in the hands of Stephen's wife and his allies, Matilda had no option but to arrange for the release of Stephen from Bristol. Hence, not much more than half a year after defeating Stephen at Lincoln, capturing him and having herself proclaimed as Lady of the English, Matilda was forced to release her cousin, and the Civil War was back to being as contentious an affair as it had ever been. Because Matilda did not renounce the titles she had adopted in April 1141, it is usually held by historians of the period that there were, in effect, two monarchs of England that had been crowned in different ways, King Stephen and Queen Matilda. This situation would continue throughout the 1140s. This was a period of a truly peculiar amount of instances in which the leaders of the Civil War were captured, imprisoned, escaped, or narrowly avoided being detained. Matilda herself had two close calls. The first came in 1141 when she was at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire. It had been built a half a century or so earlier by the Bishop of Salisbury and became one of the foremost strongholds in southwestern England by the end of the reign of Henry I. Matilda was here in 1141 when some of Stephen's forces arrived there. They appear to have been unaware that Matilda was at Devizes. Nevertheless, any effort by her to try and escape would have resulted in her being detected. Consequently, she decided to sneak out by dressing in burial clothes and then being tied down onto a funeral bier. Her attendants then carried her out of Devizes as though they were removing a corpse. Apparently, Matilda stayed in her prostrate and bound position for many hours until the company had made their way entirely out of the region in which Stephen's forces were marauding and to the safety of Gloucester. Later, her forces recaptured Devizes, and she would reward the inhabitants for their help in aiding her escape, granting them a royal charter to hold markets as a small borough town. A second close call occurred in 1142. After the rout of Winchester and the release of Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, the fighting in 1142 began to centre on Oxford. Stephen became aware that Matilda had moved her government here by that time and came to the conclusion that if he could capture her, it would strike a definitive blow and end the war. Thus, in the autumn, he advanced on Oxford, the site of an impressive castle and a town which had already emerged as a centre of higher education. Caught unaware by the advance of Stephen's forces, Matilda and her followers were trapped inside Oxford Castle as a siege began from September 1142 onwards. By the winter, over 2.5 months into the siege, conditions inside were dire, with Matilda and the others short of all manner of supplies. Stephen's plan to capture her was nevertheless foiled. In December, the Lady of the English and a handful of close followers escaped from Oxford Castle and avoided detection by Stephen's troops to make their way back west towards Bristol. There are differing accounts of how she made her escape. One has Matilda simply leaving through a postern or rear gate of the castle. Another tale, a more romantic though not implausible one, claimed that Matilda and her allies shimmied down a rope out of a window of the castle to safety and then made their escape dressed all in white to camouflage themselves against the snow which had blanketed Oxfordshire that December. Whichever is true, we do know that Matilda made yet another narrow escape and continued to fight on against Stephen into the mid-1140s. While the war had taken many shifts and turns in England in 1141 and 1142, matters were more clear-cut in northern France. Here, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had invaded Normandy and largely took over the duchy for her cause in the early 1140s. Normandy would remain under Angevin control for the most part of the remainder of the war, with Geoffrey effectively adding Normandy to the counties of Anjou, Maine and Touraine to become a French lord who could rival the King of France in terms of the size of his lands and power. By this time, the battle lines of the war had clearly emerged. France was lost to the Angevins, whereas in England Matilda controlled the West Country, West Midlands and part of the northwest of England, while Stephen had a solid base of support in the south, the home counties around London, north to East Anglia and further north again towards York. The Midlands were the front lines, though the anarchy, as the chronicles written at the time make resoundingly clear, was leading to devastation all over England as local lords and knights used the chaos and the breakdown of royal power as an opportunity to extend their own lands and benefit themselves. The mid-1140s was a period of relative inactivity in the Civil War by comparison with the dramatic events of 1141 and 1142. First, the two sides became evenly matched and consolidated their control over various parts of England. Then, events far away to the east conspired to limit the scale of the conflict. In 1144, the county of Edessa, one of the 4 major Christian Crusader states that had been established in the Levant as part of the First Crusade half a century earlier, was captured by a Syrian Muslim warlord by the name of Zengi. When word of these developments arrived to Western Europe, a new crusade was preached and gained huge support. The King of France, Louis VII, was amongst those who took the cross and headed for the Holy Land. With their liege lord having committed to the Second Crusade, many French lords, the backbone of Matilda's support in the civil war with Stephen, agreed to head east as well, though some were diverted to Iberia in the end, where Lisbon was conquered for the Christian cause in 1147. To compound matters, several of Matilda's other allies died during the mid-1140s, including Geoffrey de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, who was killed in a military clash against Stephen's forces in 1144, and her most faithful ally, her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, who died nearing his 60th year in a relatively peaceful repose at Bristol Castle in the late autumn of 1147. All of this ensured a lull in fighting during these years. The period that followed saw a fundamental change in the nature of the war. By then, Matilda's eldest son, Henry Fitz-Empress, was entering what would be considered his teenage years today, but which in the medieval era were deemed to be the first years of adulthood. In such a situation, he was increasingly presented as the potential future king if Matilda and her allies were successful in the conflict, with the possibility even that Matilda would rule in association with her son. As early as 1147, when he was just 14, Henry crossed to England from northern France at the head of a large force of mercenaries that had been hired to compensate for the loss of many troops that had headed on crusade. A symbolic changing of the guard followed as Robert of Gloucester passed away, and then Matilda left England herself in 1148. The latter decision was partly taken owing to a clash between Matilda and the Bishop of Salisbury, Jocelyn de Bohun, over the ownership of Devizes Castle, the stronghold in Wiltshire which Matilda had made her dramatic escape from disguised as a corpse back in 1141. The bishop claimed control over Devizes, even though Matilda often resided there. The dispute had escalated in the mid-1140s, with de Bohun even involving Pope Eugene III. Deciding to cut her losses, and with her son now playing a more prominent role in affairs, Matilda headed for France. She would spend most of the remaining years of the Civil War at Rouen in Normandy. The political situation continued to shift in the period that followed. A critical moment came when Matilda's second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, died suddenly and unexpectedly at just 38 years of age in September 1151. A chronicle written by John of Marmoutier claimed that Geoffrey had been attending a council of his nobles and advisers at Le Mans when he suddenly came down sick with a severe fever. His illness was swift, and he died on the 7th of September. He was buried in Saint-Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, where Matilda had an effigy of him placed over his tomb. On this, his personal coat of arms, which included a blue shield and gold lions, was displayed in one of the earliest examples of the use of a heraldic coat of arms in medieval Europe. It is significant that Matilda commissioned this, and the coat of arms in question influenced the royal coat of arms of the English monarchs in centuries to come. Geoffrey's death otherwise cemented Henry's status as the leader of the war effort on his mother's side, as he became Count of Anjou, now aged 18, and effectively Duke of Normandy as well. Already emerging as a shrewd military leader and political ruler, Henry, in conjunction with his mother, began playing a diplomatic game in the early 1150s, whereby the papacy, the King of France, and the lords of England were all courted to support Matilda and Henry's claim to the throne, the realization being that diplomacy might gain what war had failed to acquire over the previous decade. On the opposing side, a rival was emerging to Henry. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was a few years older than Henry and was being presented to the English political nation by Stephen as his successor. This was even more relevant on that side of the English Channel, as Stephen was upwards of a decade older than Matilda, and it was probable that he would die before his first cousin. Thus, from Normandy in the early 1150s, Matilda was conscious that the clash was now to see if Eustace or Henry would succeed Stephen. The days when she might claim the throne herself and rule in her own right in realization of her father's wishes so many years earlier were passing. Events culminated around the siege of Wallingford Castle in 1153, where Stephen hoped to defeat one of Matilda's major English allies, Brian Fitzcount. Henry campaigned against Stephen to prevent this. After a stalemate had been reached yet again that summer, an agreement was reached, variously known as the Treaty of Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester. Through this, Henry agreed to end his efforts to supplant Stephen and accept him as King of England, with the condition that when Stephen died, Henry would succeed him, not Eustace or any of Stephen's other sons. The Treaty of Wallingford had seemingly brought the anarchy to an end after 15 years of civil war and decades of tension over the succession. One wonders what Matilda's reaction was in Normandy when news of the agreement which her son had reached arrived there. The settlement was perhaps not as concrete as it appears, though. In the months that followed, Stephen embarked on a flurry of activity to rouse his allies and tour England. It leaves the suspicion that he was making plans to try to renounce the agreement and commence the war again once the time was politically advantageous. However, just as the death of members of the royal family during the White Ship disaster in 1120 and of old King Henry I in 1135 had led to the anarchy, the deaths of two royals in quick succession ended it in the mid-1150s. First, Eustace died unexpectedly in August 1153, and then Stephen died just over a year later in October 1154. With this, the anarchy came to an end. Matilda was victorious, though the victory was largely for her son, who quickly secured control over the government of England after Stephen's death. He was crowned on the 19th of December 1154 as King Henry II at Westminster Abbey. Fittingly, during the ceremony, one of the crowns which was used was that which Matilda had brought back from her time married to Emperor Henry V in Germany 3 decades earlier, a symbolic statement of how Henry's mother had kept her line's claim to the throne alive since her days in Central Europe as a young woman. With the death of Stephen and the accession of her son as King Henry II, Matilda found herself for the first time in nearly 2 decades not fighting a war to claim her birthright and to implement the wishes of her father. She had not become queen herself, but her eldest son, who she had symbolically named after his grandfather, had. Matilda was victorious, and she now entered a period of quasi-retirement. She did not live in England, remaining instead in Normandy and spending the remainder of her life here. Although Henry was the Duke of Normandy, his mother acted as one of his senior representatives here as the new king, unlike his great-grandfather and grandfather, William the Conqueror and Henry I, viewed himself primarily as an English monarch rather than a French lord who just happened to be King of England as well. During these years, there was also a symbolic effort to acknowledge Matilda's position as the daughter of King Henry I. Consequently, despite her retirement in Normandy, we have royal charters and other government documents from the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, which bear both Henry and Matilda's names and royal seals, a tacit acknowledgement that although Henry was the king, he had only become so through his mother stepping aside to allow him to succeed Stephen. During her later years in Normandy, Matilda became a major patron of the church and the religious orders in northern France. In particular, she was known for the favour she bestowed on the Augustinians. These were a religious order that lived monastic lives in accordance with the religious strictures of St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great early church fathers. In 1059, agreements were reached concerning monastic life at the Lateran Synod, and this prepared the way for the emergence of the Augustinians as a religious order which challenged the supremacy of the Benedictines across Christendom in the 12th century. Matilda was a major patroness of them in northern France, both during the anarchy and especially during her semi-retirement, when money could be diverted to the purpose and not towards raising armies, though both the Benedictines and the Cistercians also benefited from her benevolence. She bestowed funding on the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, for instance, an institution which she had patronized for decades, and also on Bawdsley Abbey in Worcestershire in England. In all instances, there was an awareness of the political benefits of patronizing religious abbeys and houses which played a prominent role in local politics, something Matilda had become aware of in her early years in Germany and had deployed as a political tool for decades. Her initial patronage of Bawdsley, for instance, dated back to the early 1140s, when she cultivated relations there as a means of securing control over Worcestershire in the context of the Civil War. This political scheming aside, there is no doubt that Matilda was a genuine favourer of church reform and revitalisation, and she continued in her later years to sponsor the church in Normandy and further afield. Matilda was far from politically dormant in the years following the accession of her son as king. Though most of the letters involved are lost, it is clear from the chronicles and other ancillary evidence that Matilda maintained an extensive correspondence with her son during the second half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, with letters passing from Normandy to England and back again, as she advised him on many political issues. One topic on which she tried to advise Henry concerned Thomas Becket, a leading prelate and politician who was appointed by Henry as Lord Chancellor of England shortly after his accession. In 1162, Becket was promoted to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury within the Church. This brought the formerly loyal Chancellor into conflict with Henry as the pair clashed over the rights and privileges of the Church and the degree to which the Archbishops of Canterbury were answerable to the Pope in Rome alone, or had to also seek the permission of the kings of England before acting on various matters. The dispute would intensify throughout the 1160s. Matilda advised Henry to de-escalate the situation. He did not take her advice, and eventually in 1170 Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, though the degree to which Henry sanctioned the assassination has been extensively debated ever since. She also advised Henry not to launch a military expedition to Ireland in the 1150s to begin conquering the neighbouring island from its many Irish lords. Perhaps she was right. Henry did eventually sanction such a campaign after his mother died, beginning centuries of English entanglement with Ireland. Matilda was into her 60s as her son's relationship with Becket began to deteriorate. She lived eventually to be 65 years old, a ripe old age for the time. Her later years saw her take a back seat in all matters political, no doubt enjoying the frequent visits of her grandchildren to Normandy, from amongst whom there would be two kings of England, King Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart, and King John I, two queens, Eleanor, Queen of Castile, and Joan, Queen of Sicily, and also several lords and ladies of other major polities. Her son and grandsons would rule over lands in England, France, Wales, and even Ireland, which became known as the Angevin Empire in recognition of her marriage to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, while the Plantagenet family name, which she acquired through that same union, was held by the rulers of England down to 1485, when the House of Tudor came to power at the end of the Wars of the Roses. Matilda died at home in Rouen in Normandy on the 10th of September 1167. She was buried at the Abbey of Bec, which she had patronized for decades. Her remains, though, were moved, lost, and found again on several occasions over the centuries, only to find their way to their current resting place at Rouen Cathedral in the mid-19th century. At Bec, her tomb still bears the epitaph, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry." The Empress Matilda was one of the most unusual political figures of the High Middle Ages. During a long and varied life, she became Holy Roman Empress, was involved in the governance of parts of Germany and Italy, while little more than a teenager, then became the Countess of Anjou in the late 1120s, before fighting a major civil war over a period of nearly 2 decades to claim her right to become Queen of England in fulfillment of her late father's wishes. She proved herself a formidable adversary, managing for a time in 1141 to seemingly defeat Stephen and claim her birthright, though the rout of Winchester and the subsequent release of her first cousin snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Admittedly, her unflinching determination to become Queen of England caused much suffering, with the country cast into disorder, economic devastation, and war. But Matilda was not alone in her desire to end Stephen's reign. In the end, her doggedness ensured that her cause survived for long enough for her son to rise to the fore and resolve the fundamental issue which had caused the war to begin with, the prospect of a female monarch. In the end, Matilda was not able to fully realize her father's plans for the succession, but the accession of her son as King Henry II in 1154 was as good an alternative as could be construed out of the chaos of the anarchy. What do you think of Empress Matilda? Do you think she would have made a great queen had she been allowed to rule by both Stephen and the English nobility? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The woman known to history as Isabella of France, or Queen Isabella of England, was born at some point in the mid-1290s in Paris in France, most likely in 1295 or possibly 1296. The exact date is unclear, a not uncommon occurrence when it comes to medieval births, for which records can often be fragmentary. Her father was King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair on account of his alleged good looks. He had succeeded to the French throne in 1284. Philip was also King of Navarre on account of his marriage to Isabella's mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, a small kingdom which lay primarily on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees, in what is now the Basque country in the northeast of Spain. She and Philip had married in 1284. Isabella was their sixth child. 2 daughters had been born before her, Margaret at some point in the late 1280s, and Blanche in 1290. Blanche died when she was 3 years old in 1294, before Isabella came into the world, and Margaret would also die in childhood in 1300, making Isabella her father's only daughter within a few years of her birth, and hence a valuable bargaining chip when it came to the politics of Western Europe. Isabella also had 4 brothers: Louis, born in 1289, Philippe, born around 1291, Charles, born in 1294, and Robert, born in 1296 or 1297, and thus Isabella's only younger sibling. Robert would die too in childhood, but Louis, Philippe, and Charles would each live to become kings of France and Navarre, one after another. The political circumstances of both France and England by the time of her birth in the late 13th century are critical to understanding the trajectory of Isabella's entire life. Unlike in early modern and modern times, France was not a united kingdom during either the High Middle Ages or the later medieval period. It was deeply divided, with powers such as the Dukes of Burgundy holding extensive lands in the east of the country, and others, such as the Counts of Flanders, dominating the region around much of Belgium and northeastern France. The papacy in Rome even controlled a small fiefdom in southern France centred on the city of Avignon. The kings of France nominally claimed control over the whole country. Yet their power was prone to rising and falling over the decades, with various nobles and lords exercising great amounts of independence when there were weak rulers in Paris. In contrast, King Edward I of England had created one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe since his accession in 1272, imposing English control over Wales and also waging war on Scotland to try to unify all of Britain under his rule, while he also held extensive lands in Ireland. In France, Edward held much of the southwest of the country around Bordeaux and its hinterland as Duke of Aquitaine, though this was a far cry from his predecessors in the 12th century, who at one time had held nearly half of the territory of modern-day France, with vast regions in the north and west being under English control. What this French legacy meant was that the affairs of the kings of England and France were inextricably interconnected, and this would impact on Isabella's life when she was just a child. It would continue to do so down to the end of her life, and her son would attempt to impose himself as King of France from the late 1330s onwards. Unlike many of her predecessors as Queen of England in the 12th and 13th centuries, there are a large number of sources extant today for the study of Isabella's life. Many of these were chronicles written in the medieval tradition by figures like Thomas Walsingham, a late 14th century Benedictine monk who wrote an extensive history of the rulers of England from the early 14th century up to his own time. Another was Walter of Swinbrook, whose Chronicon Angliae, or English Chronicle, charted the reigns of Isabella's husband Edward II and her son Edward III, in the process providing many details on Isabella herself and her role in both. A French chronicler, Guillaume de Nangis, wrote extensively on events at the end of the 13th century in a way which pertains to Isabella's very earliest years and the circumstances that gave rise to her marriage with Edward II. Similarly, the Wigmore Chronicles, a set of annals of major events in English history between the middle of the 11th century and the start of the 14th, also casts light on the political circumstances in England when Isabella arrived there, while there was a growing amount of bureaucratic records being produced in 14th century England due to it being the most centralized state in Western Europe at the time. Yet these sources have their limitations. Medieval chroniclers did not write with the aim of maintaining an objective perspective as modern historians aspire to. Instead, they often wrote to persuade their readers of their own political views, and so many presented Isabella in a negative light for her actions in disobeying the normal bonds of matrimony at the time. As will become clear, though, her actions were often those of a woman who had learned from a young age to survive by her wits. In a somewhat unusual development which points to the evolution of European society on the cusp of the Renaissance, Isabella was afforded an elite education, something which was not customary for women in the 13th century for the most part, and which had only become common for royal princes in the 12th century. Many rulers as recently as the 11th century had been illiterate and left the business of government largely to church figures and scribes, considering warfare their true domain. Around the Louvre Palace and the Palais de la Cité in Paris, she was surrounded by some of the leading scholars of the age at the University of Paris, and at her father's court she had access to tutors from a young age and a wide library. She grew up, as a result, to be one of the most educated royal women of the High Middle Ages. From the moment she was born, her father was doubtlessly considering who she would be married to. Incredibly, Philip had betrothed one of his daughters, Blanche, to the Infante or Prince of Castile, the future King Ferdinand IV, when she was just an infant, the better to ally France with the powerful Spanish kingdom. When she died, he then betrothed his daughter Margaret to Ferdinand, but when Margaret too passed in 1300, he declined to arrange for his final daughter to potentially marry the Castilian prince. The reason was that Isabella, who was perhaps as young as 3 or 4 years of age at the time, had been promised to Prince Edward of England, the son and heir of King Edward I, in 1299. In 1294, Isabella's father had gone to war with England in an effort to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward I while he was otherwise distracted by a war in Scotland. This unhappy conflict dragged on for several years without any conclusive results on both sides, and by 1297 both parties had decided that continuing the conflict was not worth the cost in men and money. Peace negotiations were entered into and were finally concluded in 1299 when the 60-year-old Edward I, a widower for nearly a decade, married Philip's 17-year-old sister Marguerite, while Isabella was betrothed to Prince Edward, who at least was closer to her in age, having turned 15 in the spring of 1299. The match remained simply a betrothal at this early stage, Isabella being considered too young for a marriage to actually take place even by the standards of the medieval period. Instead, the wedding would not take place for nearly a full decade longer. It was finally solemnized at the Church of Our Lady in the town of Boulogne on the northern coast of France, overlooking the English Channel, on the 25th of January, 1308. By then, Edward was 23 years of age, while Isabella was nearing her teenage years, an age that was considered to be old enough for marriage in the 14th century. By then, Isabella was marrying a king rather than a prince. Edward I had died 6 months earlier, and her new husband had succeeded him as King Edward II. It would be a problematic union from the very beginning, as Edward was bisexual and tended to prefer the company of men, though he was not averse to women, and he sired an illegitimate son a few years before his marriage to Isabella. His preference for male company also extended to favouring certain male individuals at court and allowing them and their families and factions to rise to positions of great power and wealth, something which would fracture the political community in England during his 20-year reign, shaping Isabella's life as well, in many ways in the process. A prevailing myth concerning Isabella is her relationship with the Scottish rebel William Wallace. At the time that Isabella was first betrothed to Prince Edward, his father, King Edward I, had been involved in a long-running war with the Scottish, led by a number of prominent nobles and knights, including William Wallace. This was all part of England's constant attempts throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period to impose control over all of Britain, including Scotland. Edward had famously largely conquered Scotland in the mid-1290s, dragging the Stone of Scone, the inauguration stone used by Scottish kings, back to England in 1296 as a symbol of the destruction of Scottish independence. It was a temporary development, however, and the Scots were soon at war with England again. William Wallace was captured as part of this new rebellion in Glasgow in 1305 and was executed in August of that year at Smithfield in London. Isabella was around 10 years old at this time and was still living in France. The suggestion that she ever knew or had a relationship with Wallace is a complete invention, though England's relationship with Scotland and the conflicts between the two nations would feature prominently in the politics of her time as Queen of England. Almost as soon as Isabella arrived in England, despite her young age, she would have been aware of a growing concern at court and wider afield about the influence of one Piers Gaveston over her husband. Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight from England's territories in western France, who King Edward I had assigned to his son and heir, Edward's household, in the early 1300s. The relationship soon became problematic as Gaveston's influence over the younger Edward grew and rumours flew about the court. Edward I exiled Piers from the court as a result in the mid-1300s, and then, after a brief rapprochement in 1306, ordered him to leave England entirely in 1307. Yet the old king's death just a few months later saw Gaveston being recalled, and the new king now promoted him to the title of Earl of Cornwall, while also granting him and friends and family members extensive lands and offices. All of this was creating immense unrest amongst the nobility of England, many of whom noted that the earldom of Cornwall had typically been reserved for a member of the royal family. This opposition included a faction led by the Earls of Warenne, Hereford, Pembroke and Lincoln, who, just weeks after Isabella arrived in England, urged Parliament to demand that Edward exile Gaveston yet again. The king relented, in large part because Isabella's father sent word from France that he was unhappy with news of this court favourite to whom Edward bestowed such favours, when his energies should have been on making his new wife feel at home in a foreign land. King Philip was no doubt especially dismayed to learn that when Edward and Isabella's joint coronation took place at Westminster Abbey near London, a month to the day after their marriage in northern France, Gaveston was central to the ceremony, being decked out elaborately and leading the king and queen through the main aisle of the abbey during the procession. Something clearly had to change, and Gaveston was exiled yet again, being sent off on this occasion to act as the king's lieutenant in the lordship of Ireland. Ireland was only a short boat ride away from Wales, and it was perhaps inevitable that Edward, who had been miserable when Gaveston left, conspired for Piers to return secretly in the summer of 1309. A fresh political storm followed in the months after this as it became known that Gaveston was back in England. For her part, Isabella was by then of an age to be able to fully appreciate some of the political nuances of what was happening, and also the difficult marital situation which her husband's relationship with the upstart was creating. This included the uncomfortable scenario in which Edward, Isabella and Piers ended up heading north to oversee a military campaign against the Scots, who were making incursions into northern England under their new leader, Robert Bruce, the aspirant to the throne of Scotland. Edward's decision to give Gaveston command over much of the campaign that followed was sufficient cause for the nobles to yet again call for his exile in 1311. A final departure and return to England was the limit of their patience. When he reappeared in England in 1312, a cohort of nobles led by the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick and Pembroke orchestrated to have him detained and killed that summer. Isabella must have breathed a sigh of relief, but there would soon be a new royal favourite and new problems, while the tensions between Edward and his nobles would continue virtually unabated for the next 15 years. Eventually, as she grew older and learned to look after her own interests, Isabella would move from being a bystander in these political intrigues to a major player herself. Isabella's relief at the death of Gaveston in the summer of 1312 was added to by the birth of her and Edward's first child just a few months later. Edward of Windsor was born on the 13th of November 1312 at Windsor Castle and was named after both his father and grandfather. Young Edward, like his mother, would have to grow up prematurely in his early teenage years as political events conspired around him. All of that was to come, though. In the interim, Isabella and Edward II had 3 further children, while suffering at least one miscarriage. Another boy, John, was born in 1316, solidifying the line of succession with 2 male heirs. 2 daughters then followed, Eleanor of Woodstock in the summer of 1318 and Joan in the summer of 1321, often referred to as Joan of the Tower, as her mother gave birth to her in the Tower of London, the city's great medieval and early modern fortress. Isabella was seemingly central to one of the more colourful episodes to occur at the French court in the early 14th century, the Tour de Nesle affair, named after a guard tower of the old city walls of Paris. Each of her brothers had married into the nobility of Burgundy of eastern France, which, as we have seen, was a powerful rival to the French crown for dominance over large parts of the country, and would remain so for another century and a half. Her brother, Louis, for instance, married Margaret of Burgundy, the second daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy. Philippe married Joan, the daughter of Count Otto IV of Burgundy. Finally, Joan's sister Blanche of Burgundy married Isabella's other brother, Charles. The affair has taken on a quasi-legendary aspect over the centuries. Rumour at the time had it that, on a major state visit to France in the summer of 1313, shortly after the Gaveston affair had seemed to bring a period of temporary peace to England, Isabella had sewn some purses for each of her brothers and her sisters-in-law. Not too long afterwards, at a social gathering at court, she noticed that 2 knights, Sir Gautier of Aunay and Sir Philippe of Aunay, were carrying the purses which she had embroidered for 2 of her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Margaret. Fearing that they were engaged in affairs with the 2 knights, Isabella relayed her concerns to her father. King Philip responded by having some of his spies monitor the 2 knights and his 2 daughters-in-law. The results of the investigations led to the conclusion that Blanche and Margaret had been engaged in infidelities, meeting the 2 knights at the Tour de Nesle tower along the city walls. In the ensuing fallout, it was also concluded that while Philip's wife, Joan, had not been unfaithful to her husband, she had known of the affair her sister Blanche was engaged in and was complicit in a sense as a result. In the period that followed, both Blanche and Margaret were arrested and placed in prison, while Sir Gautier and Sir Philippe were executed for their role in what was a serious social and political embarrassment for the French royal family. Blanche and Margaret were placed on trial and subjected to a public humiliation by having their heads shaved. They were then sent to the Château Gaillard. Margaret died within a year, perhaps on the orders of her husband, who had become king after Isabella's father's death in November 1314, while Blanche remained imprisoned until her marriage was finally annulled in 1322, and her husband was free to marry again. Joan was eventually forgiven by her husband for her alleged role in covering up her sister and sister-in-law's actions. Isabella came out of the entire affair looking poorly to the French populace, who eventually felt sympathy for Margaret and Blanche's plight. The royal visit to France in the summer of 1313 was important in other ways. It was an episode which saw Isabella emerge for the first time as a significant power broker between England and France, and her entry into the world of high politics as she became what we would now deem to be a young woman. The occasion was the triple knighting of her three brothers, who would then knight hundreds of other Frenchmen in a grand royal occasion which symbolized the arrival of a new generation of French nobles and leaders. Days of celebrations occurred in which Edward and Isabella were often central. There was a formal event as well, in which many individuals, Isabella included, took the cross, the symbol of the Crusaders that had been worn since 1095 when the First Crusade began, though by 1313 the Crusader states in the Holy Land had all been conquered by the Islamic powers there. We get an insight into the foibles of royalty here, as one chronicler noted with some amusement that Edward and Isabella overslept for the ceremony of the taking of the cross. More seriously, negotiations followed in the days ahead in which King Philip, Isabella's father, assured Edward that he would have support from France if he needed it against his fractious nobles back in England. Isabella had seemingly been central to the diplomacy involved. Back in England, Isabella was soon learning that the murder of Gaveston had not brought an end to the domestic turmoil of her husband's realm. In the months prior to Gaveston's fall, the faction which was opposed to him had come to be controlled by Thomas, 2nd Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of Edward's, whose grandfather was King Henry III, and whose father, Edmund Crouchback, had been King Edward I's brother. Thomas also traced his ancestry on his mother's side back to the royal families of France and Navarre. This made Lancaster the most powerful noble in England, and he had been instrumental in Gaveston's downfall. After the favourite was murdered, there followed an uneasy reconciliation between him and the king, one in which it was made clear that Edward was a monarch whose power had been seriously undermined. The years that followed were consequently characterised by continuing political turmoil, compounded when the Scots won a major victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, gaining the upper hand in the Scottish War of Independence in the process. As Edward lay on the precipice of losing Scotland, which his father had largely completed the conquest of 20 years earlier, his standing in the eyes of his nobles plummeted even further. The years that followed were marked by a growing drift towards outright conflict yet again between Edward and his nobles. The instability was compounded by a major famine between 1315 and 1317, aroused by bad weather and the mass outbreak of a bovine disease which eviscerated cattle stocks across England. The Crown did nothing to assuage public opinion during this time by continuing its lavish spending, Isabella included, who had developed a habit of wasting large amounts of money on overt pomp and ceremony. When she had visited France without her husband in 1314, for instance, the expedition required 27 ships and 13 barges to transport all of her belongings and servants across the Channel. Such frivolous expense did not go unnoticed amongst her and Edward's subjects. Yet, as damaging as the famine of the mid-1310s, the loss to the Scots, and the Crown's profligate spending were, the issue which would spark another crisis and war was the king's continuing promotion of court favourites. For a time after Gaveston was murdered, the individual involved was Roger d'Amory, but he was soon displaced in the king's affections by Hugh Despencer the Younger, the son and heir of Hugh Despencer the Elder, Baron Despencer. As Despencer rose as a new version of Gaveston in the late 1310s, a Despencer faction emerged as well, with many individuals around him being given lands, titles, and offices by the king. The nobles were not impressed, and in May 1321, war broke out in England as a faction led by Lancaster, Humphrey de Bohun, 4th Earl of Hereford, and a former Lord Lieutenant of the English Lordship in Ireland, Roger Mortimer, emerged to challenge Edward and the Despensers. The Despencer War, as it is often termed, lasted for 10 months between May 1321 and March 1322. In its early stages, the alliance of anti-Despencer nobles had the better of it and converged on London. It was this military action which forced Isabella to take refuge in the Tower of London and so gave birth to her daughter Joan there. It was just weeks later that Isabella intervened, with Edward apparently going down on her knees before her husband and imploring him to expel Despencer from England in order to bring peace back to the country. Incredibly, Edward agreed to her request and commanded Hugh and his father to leave the country. However, Isabella was also central within weeks to the renewed outbreak of hostilities when, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, she was refused entry to and hospitality at Leeds Castle in Kent, an abode of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, a lord who had sided with Lancaster and others against Edward just months earlier. The king took this rebuff of his wife as the excuse he needed to recommence the war, and within weeks the Despensers were back in England with fresh reinforcements. By the spring, it was all over, with Edward and the Despensers having won victory over Lancaster, Hereford, Mortimer, and their allies at the Battle of Borough Bridge on the 16th of March 1322. Whether Isabella was an oblivious pawn in Edward's machinations and he simply used the event at Leeds Castle as an excuse to resume hostilities, or whether her entire pilgrimage to Canterbury was a clever ploy which Isabella had been complicit in, remains a mystery to this day. Victory in the Despencer War saw Edward exact revenge for a decade of wrongs which he believed had been committed by his nobles. Hereford was killed in the fighting at Borough Bridge, seemingly dying in a particularly gruesome manner, his screams apparently dismaying his soldiers and contributing to the defeat. Lancaster was placed on trial, where a panel led by the Despensers refused to let him speak in his own defence and found him guilty. He was executed 6 days after Borough Bridge, while Mortimer was detained and sentenced to death. However, he would have his sentence commuted to life imprisonment in the Tower of London in what was a significant development for Isabella's future affairs. He escaped from the Tower in August 1323, and after a brief effort to raise a fresh revolt against the crown, fled to France. In the interim, the Despensers and their faction now had free rein to rule England as they wished. For his part, Edward began inflicting punishment on anyone who he perceived to have been responsible for Gaveston's murder back in 1312 and the undermining of his royal authority ever since. Dozens of lords and members of their families were placed in prison. Others were even less fortunate. Bartholomew de Badlesmere, the owner of Leeds Castle, where Isabella's being refused hospitality in the late autumn of 1321 had reignited the Despenser War, was dragged by a horse through the streets of Canterbury before being hanged and decapitated outside the town, his head placed on a pike overlooking anyone who entered or left the Kentish religious centre as a symbol of Edward's newfound power and tyranny. If Edward believed in the mid-1320s, in the aftermath of the Despenser War, that he was finally free from opposition and could rule as much as he pleased, he would soon find out that he was wrong. And with Lancaster, Hereford, and many of his other opponents dead, the opposition would now come from a different, unexpected source: his wife. There were multiple reasons for her growing alienation. In late 1322, she was placed in danger while in northern England when her husband failed to respond quickly enough to a Scottish incursion into the north of the country. More worryingly, in January 1322, Isabella's brother Charles had ascended to the throne of France as King Charles IV. Over the next year or so, relations between England and France deteriorated over a number of issues, of which Edward's position as Duke of Aquitaine in western France was central. As this occurred, the Despensers began targeting Isabella herself and her large number of French staff, many of whom had lived with her in England since her arrival in 1308. In all, 27 of her household staff were removed and arrested on the grounds of being French, as well as her chaplain and personal physician. The Queen was also stripped of most of her personal lands, and her household budget was drastically reduced. The final straw was when the Despensers removed her 3 younger children, John, Eleanor, and Joan, from her custody and entrusted their upbringing to Hugh Despenser's wife and sister. All of these attacks on her would combine to lead Isabella to begin plotting her own assault on the Despensers and her husband from the mid-1320s onwards. The opportunity she had been looking for came when she was sent as an envoy to France in March 1325. Isabella was dispatched across the Channel with a large retinue of staff who were loyal to Edward and the Despensers, her instructions being to negotiate peace terms in the war which had erupted between England and France, and then to return so that Edward could finally settle the war with the Scots without fear of French intervention. She was determined to act differently. Over a period of several months of negotiation in France, she moved the debate to concentrate on whether or not her husband, as Duke of Aquitaine, would come to France to pay homage to her brother, who, as King of France, was theoretically Edward's liege lord. Edward was unwilling to do this, but in response, Isabella proposed an alternative solution in the early autumn of 1325. If her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, was sent to France, Charles would accept him paying homage as the basis for peace without his father, King Edward II, having to do so. Such a neat solution was quickly accepted, and Prince Edward, who was conveniently in southern England at the time, was conveyed across the Channel to his mother. King Edward and the Despensers had fallen for the trap. with Prince Edward, the eldest son and heir to the Kingdom of England, now in Isabella's custody and the safety of her brother's French dominions, she was in a position to launch her own campaign against her husband and the Despensers. Isabella's actions in the autumn of 1325 were compounded in the months that followed by her developing liaison with Roger Mortimer, one of the leaders of the opposition to the crown during the Despenser War, who had subsequently been imprisoned and then escaped from the Tower of London. There is no evidence to indicate, as some historians of the 19th century attempted to argue, that Isabella helped Mortimer escape from the Tower back in 1323 before he fled to France. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in France, in late 1325, she began meeting with Mortimer, who had become the de facto head of an anti-crown and anti-Despenser party of English exiles in Paris. The relationship became sexual towards the end of 1325. Isabella must have been aware how risky all of her behaviour now was. After all, 2 of her sisters-in-law had been placed on trial and imprisoned over a decade earlier during the Tour de Nesle affair, owing to their infidelities. The affair she now began with Mortimer was to be one of the most colourful in the history of medieval Europe, one which burned brightly for half a decade and impacted hugely on England's politics, while also transgressing deeply held ideas of the time concerning matrimony and patriarchy. A more colourful description might suggest that they were somewhat like a medieval royal Bonnie and Clyde. By early 1326, with Prince Edward in their custody and a growing amount of financial and military support being provided by Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, Isabella and Mortimer were ready to make their move against her erstwhile husband and the Despensers. On the 22nd of September 1326, with a small flotilla of ships and men, she set sail for England, ships mainly provided by Count Guillaume of Hainaut, whose daughter Philippa Isabella had promised her son Prince Edward would marry in return for his support. They landed on the coast of Suffolk in East Anglia 2 days later. In the days that followed, the unpopular and tyrannical regime of Edward and the Despensers collapsed, as leading nobles and lords abandoned the crown and sided with the small army of invaders from France led by Isabella and Mortimer. Calls for troops to muster in defence of the government were ignored, while towns and cities such as Cambridge opened their gates to the small army from France. By early October, as Isabella and Mortimer moved towards London, Edward fled from the capital towards the West Midlands and then into Wales. On the 16th of November, the invasion culminated in its great success when Edward and Despenser were captured in southern Wales. Edward's fate would wait for later, but 8 days later Despenser was found guilty in a perfunctory trial, following which he was hung from the city walls of Hereford before being disemboweled and castrated while still alive, the ordeal of being hanged, drawn and quartered only coming to an end when the executioner beheaded him. Despenser was dead, and Isabella and Mortimer were in charge of England. But there was still the somewhat tricky matter of the king, who was still alive and also married to Isabella. Initially, he was placed into the custody of Henry of Lancaster at Monmouth Castle. In the weeks thereafter, Isabella's advisers devised an ingenious way of dispensing with him. Edward had briefly taken ship in the Irish Sea in the desperate days before he was captured. He had been forced to land in Wales, but the incident was now used to deploy an argument that in abandoning his kingdom, Edward had abdicated his crown. The logic followed that when he did so, Isabella and his eldest child, Prince Edward, succeeded him as King Edward III. Thus was the 14-year-old Edward installed as king in January 1327, though with Isabella and Mortimer now heading up a regency government on his behalf during his minority. They would be the real power behind the throne for years to come. The deposed king was moved to Berkeley Castle in the spring of 1327. He was, apparently, well treated there in his imprisonment for the next several months. That is, until the 21st of September, when he was almost certainly discreetly murdered on Mortimer and Isabella's orders. Isabella and Mortimer were received in England when they arrived from France in the autumn of 1326 as saviours from the quasi-tyranny of Edward II and the Despencer faction. However, many people soon realized that they had simply swapped one form of irresponsible kleptocracy and heavy-handed rule for another. In particular, the land grab which Isabella and Mortimer engaged in the course of 1327 and 1328 was incredible. Isabella had her dower lands, which had been stripped from her back in 1323, returned to her, but in addition, she seized huge estates which made her wealthier than any magnate had been in England for decades, with an annual rental from her lands across England and Wales that exceeded, by a considerable margin, those that Thomas of Lancaster, the greatest noble in the kingdom during much of Edward II's reign, had controlled. She also seized half a dozen prominent castles across England, notably Bristol Castle and Pontefract. She'd go on to drain the exchequer of any remaining funds, some admittedly to pay off her soldiers, but others to finance her own largesse in the years ahead. The behaviour was echoed by Mortimer, who quickly seized vast estates across southern Wales and the English West Midlands, proclaiming himself as the Earl of March in tandem to symbolise his preponderant position in the March or border region between England and Wales. All of this very quickly saw public sentiment towards Isabella and Mortimer shift. A regency council which included many of the leading nobles who had survived the purges of the Despencer period and the overthrow of Edward II had been established to govern the country until such time as Edward III was of an age to rule himself. It was revealed within months, however, that Isabella and Mortimer considered this to be merely a piece of window dressing to legitimize what was effectively rule by Isabella and her lover, who could not even marry each other after Edward II was killed, because Mortimer was still married to Joan de Joinville, with whom he had had a dozen children over the years. What created a scenario in which their regency became untenable were events in Scotland. In 1328, Isabella and Mortimer agreed to end the interminable war which had been underway between England and Scotland for decades by agreeing to recognise an independent Scotland with Robert Bruce as its king. To cement the alliance, Isabella offered for her youngest daughter, Joan of the Tower, to marry Bruce's son and heir, 4-year-old David, thus cementing a new rapprochement with the Scots. But while Isabella and Mortimer deemed this to be a good end to the conflict with the Scots, young King Edward III, who was now nearing his 16th birthday, considered it to be a humiliation and the abdication of much of his birthright. From this juncture, he was plotting to overthrow his mother and her lover and begin to rule in their place. The young king did not move immediately. His reticence was brought about by the failure of a rebellion in early 1329 by the 3rd Earl of Lancaster, a close cousin of the king's and the brother of the second Earl of Lancaster, who was executed at the end of the Despencer War back in 1322. Lancaster had allied with several prominent nobles to overthrow Mortimer and Isabella, yet had been outflanked by their armies when he moved on London. He surrendered and was neutralized as a threat. The entire episode served as a warning to Edward III, and his household was filled with staff loyal to his mother and Mortimer. What finally brought matters to a head was the execution, in March 1330, of the Earl of Kent, a younger son of King Edward I and Edward III's half-uncle. The political realm was shocked by this transgression, and Lancaster now implored Edward to act, which he did. In mid-October 1330, he and his conspirators surrounded Isabella and Mortimer with their retinue at Nottingham Castle. Both were detained, and Edward finally affirmed his decision to begin ruling in his own stead on the cusp of his 18th birthday. 6 weeks later, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn in London. Isabella had pleaded for his life to be spared. Her son had refused to listen. Isabella was placed under house arrest following the fall of her and Mortimer from power and her lover's execution. Her detention was at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire to begin with for several weeks, before she was moved to Windsor Castle shortly before Christmas 1330 in what was evidently a relaxing of her conditions, as she was placed closer to where her son would have contact with her. During these months, there were clearly conversations had with her about how she could be reconciled to the new situation and rehabilitated. The story which would be presented going forward was that Isabella had been led astray by the malevolent Mortimer and as a result had temporarily failed to live in a manner which lived up to her responsibilities towards her son as King of England. As these negotiations were underway, she was also mourning Mortimer, and such was her emotional state that more than one historian has concluded that she suffered a nervous breakdown of some kind during these months. Eventually, she recovered, and ever a realist and pragmatist when it came to politics, she agreed to the new narrative which had been decided upon. Since she had arrived in England 22 years earlier as a child to marry Edward II, she had learned to survive on her wits. And the circumstances she found herself in now in the early 1330s, still some way shy of her 40th year, was no different. Satisfied that she posed no further threat to her son's reign, the decision was taken to set her free in 1332. While Isabella was free from 1332 onwards, there was no doubt at all that her political life was at a virtual end. The vast lands that she had accumulated from late 1326 onwards were surrendered to the Crown back at the end of 1330, but Edward now granted her Castle Rising in Norfolk and East Anglia, where she would live in her retirement. He was more than generous, allotting her a pension of £3,000 a year as well, a fortune in 14th century terms. Despite a belief in the past that Isabella was in semi-exile here, this was certainly not the case. She was regularly visited over the years by leading nobles calling to see the Queen Dowager and the mother of the king, while Edward III called on occasion too, during which Castle Rising was transformed into the centre of the political world in England as the royal court relocated here. Over time, she became a doting grandmother, as the marriage between her son and Philippa of Hainaut, which she had negotiated back in 1326, resulted in a large brood of children from the birth of a new Edward, the Black Prince, in 1330, with many more following over the 1330s and into the 1340s. Over time, she was also welcomed back to the royal court at Windsor or in London on occasion. In many ways, it was the attainment of much of what she had always sought: comfort and stability, the very things which her husband's tumultuous reign had deprived her of from her teenage years onwards, and which she had begun her relationship with Mortimer in pursuit of. Isabella was able to play a slight role in political affairs in her long retirement, owing to events in France. Back in 1328, while she and Mortimer were effectively ruling England in the name of her son, Isabella's brother Charles died, the third and last of her brothers to die in quick succession after Louis in 1316, who seems to have succumbed to pleurisy, and Philippe in 1322. Although Louis had a son, he died in infancy after spending just 5 days on the throne himself in 1316, while both Philippe and Charles died without a male heir. Furthermore, the Salic law in France forbade a woman from becoming queen regnant, unlike in England. This opened up the possibility of Edward III having a legitimate claim to the French throne on account of his being the son of Isabella and the grandson of King Philippe the Fair. However, at a meeting of the French nobles shortly after Charles's death, it was determined that Philippe, Count of Valois, would succeed as King Philippe VI and start a new royal line. This dispensation held firm for nearly a decade. However, in 1337, England and France ended up at war after Philippe attempted to confiscate a chunk of England's remaining lands in western France around Gascony and the county of Ponthieu. With this, Edward went to war with the French. And not only that, but he decided to press his claim to the throne of France, which had been passed over in 1328. It was the beginning of what would be the 100 Years' War between England and France, as successive English monarchs tried to resurrect the Angevin Empire of the 12th century, when England had ruled much of France. As the woman through whom Edward based his claim to the French throne, and as one of the only senior surviving members of the royal house of Capet, Isabella suddenly had a new political significance from the late 1330s onwards. The 100 Years' War is generally divided into several distinct phases, in some of which England's fortunes were buoyant, while in others France gained the upper hand. The first phase lasted from the outbreak of the war in 1337 down to 1360, and was, generally, one in which England had the better of the fighting, particularly in the mid to late 1340s, when Edward led campaigns to France and won major strategic victories at the battles of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Calais the following year. With this, peace negotiations in which it was assumed the French would make considerable concessions to Edward were commenced. At this juncture, there was a proposal that Isabella, with her French heritage, would possibly be sent to France to negotiate on behalf of her son, whose claim to the French throne was based on Isabella being the last surviving child of King Philippe the Fair. Yet the outbreak of the Black Death, the worst first wave of the bubonic plague across Europe, scuppered the planned diplomatic mission and stalled affairs in the wider war thereafter for several years. It was not until 1356 that a major breakthrough was made again, when Edward won another significant victory at the Battle of Poitiers, where King John II of France was captured. Following this, Isabella was involved in English negotiations with Charles II, King of Navarre, whose dominions lay to the south of the English possessions in Aquitaine in southwestern France, and who was a relative of Isabella's, his grandfather having been King Louis X of France, Isabella's brother. Charles was aiming to claim the French throne himself after King John was captured at Poitiers, though he failed in this, and whatever Isabella's intervention with him might have achieved, it could not stop Charles constantly switching sides in the wider conflict between France and England. The diplomatic mission to Charles of Navarre was one of the last actions of Isabella's life. She appeared at Windsor Castle, which her son had expanded dramatically to make the finest royal castle in England, for the St. George's Day celebrations there on the 23rd of April 1358, and was noted for the riches of her dress, which purportedly was inlaid with hundreds of precious gemstones, such as rubies, and upwards of 2,000 pearls. This ostentatious display of wealth was somewhat in contrast to her decision just a few weeks later to take the nun's habit of the Poor Clares, or Order of St. Clare, a monastic order founded centuries earlier by St. Clare of Assisi, one of St. Francis's first followers. She had been ill for several months and must have been aware, when she made this decision, that her life was coming to an end. Isabella died on the 22nd of August 1358, most likely at 63 or so years of age. A longer than usual delay followed before her funeral was finally held on the 27th of November 1358. Although it had already become a tradition to bury the kings of England at Westminster Abbey by this time, this did not necessarily extend to queen consorts, and so Isabella was interred at the Greyfriars Church in London alongside her aunt, Queen Marguerite, Edward I's second wife, and the same king's mother, Eleanor of Provence, wife of King Henry III. There she was laid to rest with the clothes she had worn as a child on the cusp of her teenager years the day she married Edward II, half a century earlier, draped over her. Her daughter, Joan of the Tower, was buried there as well 4 years later. Many of those who might have looked at Isabella as a malevolent figure who had extended the instability wrought by Edward II's reign beyond 1326 may have looked to the future as potentially being a more favourable time for England. And it must be said that for a time in the middle of the 14th century under her son, the kingdom's fortunes did markedly improve, as England had the better of the opening stages of the 100 Years' War. But they would soon have been disabused of this notion in the period following Isabella's death. England's problem, it transpired, did not lie with the former queen, but within the wider politics of the realm. Edward's grandson, King Richard II, presided over a period from his accession in the late 1370s, in which renewed unrest between England's nobles and the crown broke out. It ebbed and flowed until he was overthrown and killed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Isabella's great-grandson, in 1399. And this only led to a period of vague stability until the middle of the 15th century, when a new civil war, the Wars of the Roses, erupted again. Isabella and Mortimer, it turned out, were symptoms of the political instability which constantly pitted the crown against the nobles in late medieval England, not the cause of it. Isabella of France has a reputation as one of the most formidable female figures of English history, being termed a she-wolf in 2 eminent early 21st century studies of her life. But if she became a she-wolf over time, she certainly did not arrive in England as one. Instead, she was a child being married off to an adult male in a foreign land for the sake of political expediency. Then, as she grew up, she learned that her husband was a ruler who was seemingly intent on choosing favourites at his court in ways which antagonized the majority of the political community. There was constant instability around her and war with foreign enemies. In this environment, she had to adapt, and became ruthless herself in trying to promote her own interests in a situation where she knew her husband would not. It was this situation which led to her eventually beginning her relationship with Mortimer and overthrowing her own husband. She was badly regarded for centuries as a result, a development which simply points towards a latent misogyny in assessing the actions of a woman who was deemed to have broken the natural laws of matrimony. Many historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries suggested that she destabilized England as a result. But in reality, the conflicts of the 1320s were merely few amongst many which characterized the English crown's relationship with the wider political community between the 12th and 17th centuries. Ultimately, if Isabella was ruthless, it was in response to finding herself in this politically volatile environment at such a young and vulnerable age. What do you think of Isabella of France? Was she a malevolent schemer who destabilized England, or was she simply a woman who, having been cast into the maelstrom of English politics as a child, learned to survive as best she could? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The woman known to history as Margaret Beaufort was born on the 31st of May either in 1441 or in 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, Bedfordshire. Her father was John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who was the grandson of John of Gaunt, the fourth son of Edward III, a genealogical connection that Margaret was to exploit in order to legitimize her son Henry's claim to the throne during the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's mother was Margaret Beauchamp, the daughter of Sir John Beauchamp of Bletsoe, and the heiress to her family's fortune after her only brother, John Beauchamp, died childless and unmarried in 1421, making her an attractive and wealthy match for her first husband, Oliver St. John, whose death in 1438 made her available for John Beaufort to marry. Margaret's pursuit of royal power was somewhat hindered by a series of scandals that had enveloped her family generations earlier. The first of these concerned her own father, who, after being imprisoned by the French following his capture at the Battle of Beaujeu in 1421 in Henry V's wars against the French king, paid a staggering £24,000 ransom, equivalent to £15 million today, to secure his release over 17 years later in 1438. However, although he was impoverished by the extortionate price he had to pay for his release, he did benefit financially when he married Margaret from the vast estates that she held around Bedfordshire, Wiltshire, and Dorset. Although Margaret was the sole product of her mother's marriage to John Beaufort, Margaret Beauchamp was much more fruitful in her previous marriage, and so her daughter had many half-sisters and half-brothers, namely John, Oliver, Edith, Mary, Margaret, and Elizabeth St. John, a side of the family that Margaret Beaufort remained close with throughout her life. After marrying his wife Margaret in 1442, John Beaufort returned to the battlefield as a commander of an English regiment that was to fight against King Charles VII of France after his invasion of Gascony in 1443, presenting him with a perfect opportunity to reignite his military career. After being anointed Captain General of Aquitaine and Normandy and bestowed with the title of Duke of Somerset by an Act of Parliament, John Beaufort set out to prove himself to his contemporaries but his campaign to France went disastrously wrong, and he was exposed as a poor and cowardly leader, who, although able to take some minor French towns, never had the courage to directly engage the French army, being further lambasted for allowing his men to pillage and plunder at will, and also for his misappropriation of royal funds, which he used to enrich himself. Returning to England after his disappointing tour of duty, Henry VI was so infuriated with his conduct that he refused to see him, and John Beaufort was left with no other option but to retire to his country estate in Dorset, where, eaten away with unbearable shame, he decided to take his own life on the 27th of May, 1444. His young daughter was barely a year old at the time. The humiliating conduct and death of Margaret's father was compounded by another, even more serious family transgression that happened even earlier, as the Beauforts' link to royalty was always somewhat tainted due to the fact that they originated from an initially illegitimate offshoot following John of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford, the governess to his children from his first marriage to Blanche of Lancaster. Following the death of John's wife Constance in 1394, the woman he had been unfaithful to, his relationship to Catherine was legitimized after they married in January 1396, which meant that all his future offspring would be officially recognized as having royal blood. Yet, despite this, the fact that some of their children had been born out of wedlock meant that the scandal surrounding John of Gaunt lived on throughout the years, persisting all the way up to his great-great-grandson, King Henry VII, where it was used as a tool to invalidate his reign. Margaret herself was a woman of remarkable devotion, kindness, and generosity, and later in her life used her almost inexhaustible funds to donate heavily to the Church, an institution she had the utmost respect for and that represented the Christian religion that would serve as a guiding light for her in some of her darkest hours, especially regarding the safety of her son, as Margaret was a dedicated family woman who found purpose in her life safeguarding the Tudor bloodline, a desire that was emulated by the care and attention she always showed towards her beloved Henry, her only child, a primal protective instinct she also extended to her dearly loved grandchildren, who she adoringly showered with gifts. The seriousness in which Margaret approached the survival of her bloodline could often spill over into her mischievous sense of humour, where all niceties would be set aside for those who had dared challenge her family, such as the rather overweight Duchess of Burgundy and her equally rotund entourage, who had supported a pretender to the throne and were, to Margaret, in a letter to the Queen's Chamberlain in April 1496, great ladies all, and according to their great estates, they have great personages. Yet Margaret, although strong-willed in everything she set her heart on, was never needlessly cruel to her enemies, something that Henry took great pains to implement in his own reign. In addition, Margaret, who was renowned for her love of cards and was even known to place bets on chess, equally relished playing the game of real estate, and during her early years, when her property was constantly threatened by her Yorkist rivals, made every effort to maneuver herself into a stronger position either through political intrigue or marriage, for one of her main aims was to retain her inheritance for the sake of her son Henry, and it was with this singular dedication to her son's welfare that she would eventually harbour the greatest ambition of them all, for her son to become King of England. At the time of Margaret Beaufort's birth in 1443, the Kingdom of England was ruled by the House of Lancaster, an offshoot of the House of Plantagenet, which had governed England and its overseas possessions since 1154, and its weak-willed King Henry VI, who led efforts to resist the annexation of English lands in northern France by French Emperor Charles VII and his Burgundian allies in the closing stages of the 100 Years' War. This was a conflict that would not only lead to the dishonour of John Beaufort, but to the eventual loss of England's entire realm abroad during Margaret's lifetime, and to the rise of another branch of the Plantagenets, the House of York, as serious contenders for the English throne. Following the death of Margaret's father, and in conjunction with the fact that she was of royal descent and no longer had a male protector, many noble houses in the realm became very interested in securing her wardship, a type of guardianship in which the selected family would be able to determine the fate of the infant heir's property, as Margaret, being the eldest child of John Beaufort, had, in combination with her mother's impressive portfolio, also inherited all of the vast lands her father held in Kent, Worcestershire, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Somerset, Essex, and Sussex, making her an extremely wealthy individual at a very young age. Beaufort's untimely passing, and the fact that Margaret was technically part of the royal family, sprung King Henry VI into action, who entrusted her wardship to William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, and steward of the king's household, who secured her betrothal to his own son, John de la Pole, in 1450, which was to be carried out when she was 12 and had come of age. However, despite being in the legal custody of the de la Poles, Margaret never left her ancestral home at Bletsoe Castle, where she would have shared her childhood with the numerous offspring of her mother's first marriage to Oliver St. John, including her half-brothers John and Oliver, and half-sisters Edith, Mary, and Margaret. At Bletsoe, Margaret enjoyed a privileged upbringing befitting of a noble woman of her stature, and here she would be taught to properly manage and administrate hereditary estates, would listen to the finest musicians hired to entertain her aristocratic clan, and where she, alongside her half-sister Margaret St. John, who would later become Abbess of Shaftesbury, would first be inducted into the Christian faith. She was taught about the importance of religion by her own devout mother, who would also instill in the young Margaret a voracious appetite to read, illustrated by her mother's will, in which she bequeathed to her many books, all of which were doubtlessly added to the impressive library Margaret fervently maintained as an adult. Nevertheless, after Margaret's betrothal to John de la Pole in 1450, Margaret would find herself, at 6 years old, at the centre of a scandal that rocked England, as her guardian, the unpopular William de la Pole, was blamed for encouraging Henry VI to follow a policy of peace and cooperation with the King of France, which had resulted in the loss of a significant number of English possessions on the continent and the retention of just Calais and Aquitaine by the end of August 1450, charges which were made a lot worse by the further accusation that de la Pole was planning to take advantage of Margaret's royal stock to advance his own family's claim to the throne by marrying her to his son. Even after William de la Pole was killed by his enemies after being intercepted in the North Sea on his way to exile in France, Margaret remained promised to his son, while King Henry VI, who had been humiliated by his loss of territory in France, found his ascendancy challenged by Richard, Duke of York, who in February 1452 marched on London, but although nothing came of it and he was eventually pardoned, tension continued to rise between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Henry was keen to consolidate his own support by awarding honours to those who had stuck by him in the face of the Duke of York's open hostility, including his half-brother Edmund Tudor, and so, in February 1453, a nearly 10-years-old Margaret was summoned to Henry's court in London, where her marriage contract with John de la Pole was nullified, and where she was re-promised instead to Edmund Tudor, who alongside his brother Jasper Tudor became her new wards on the 24th of March, a personal triumph for the brothers who were made rich beyond their wildest dreams, for they would now share Margaret's enormous inheritance between them. Now betrothed to a man who was a close confidant of the king, Margaret eagerly threw herself into court life, attending one of her first royal functions on the 23rd of April 1453 at Windsor Castle for the Garter celebrations, where she appeared alongside Henry's glamorous Queen Margaret, bedecked in an exquisite red dress, a fashion statement that would no doubt have inspired the young and impressionable Margaret to follow suit after King Henry gifted her 100 marks for clothes on the 12th of May for her upcoming first meeting with her future husband, Edmund Tudor, the man who would tie her permanently to the Lancastrian cause, and with the death of Margaret's uncle Somerset, one of Henry VI's most trusted advisers, a few days later on the 22nd of May 1455, at the Battle of St. Albans, following the Duke of York's resumption of hostilities, marking the start of the Wars of the Roses, he was to remain her only male protector. Just 12 days after St. Albans, on the 31st of March 1455, Margaret married Edmund Tudor, who was 10 years her senior, in the process elevating herself significantly up the Lancastrian ladder and taking the title Countess of Richmond, which she retained for the rest of her life. She settled with her new husband at Llanfay in Pembrokeshire, Wales, where Edmund was tasked with maintaining law and order and curbing the authority of the rebellious Welsh magnate and Yorkish supporter Griffith ap Nicholas, who at the time had control of the most important administrative centre in the region, Carmarthen Castle. This was a period of Margaret's life that was to be marked by uncertainty and anxiety. The first fray occurred when Edmund successfully seized the castle at Carmarthen, compelling the Yorkists to reply by sending a force under the command of Sir William Herbert and Sir Walter Devereux, whose 2,000-strong regiment proved too strong for Edmund, and whose brief imprisonment on the 10th of August 1455 caused Margaret great despair, as the couple had successfully consummated the marriage, and she was deeply afraid for the safety of her unborn child. Although Edmund was released, to the great relief of his teenage bride, an even more tragic twist of fate was to happen when Margaret was just 6 months pregnant, her marriage abruptly ending following Edmund's death from the plague on the 1st of November 1456, a disease that Margaret, now alone and vulnerable in hostile territory, was so terrified would also kill her and the baby growing inside her, that she requested every medical treatise on the illness that she could find, in an obsession to keep it at bay. Desperate for a protector, Jasper Tudor, fully aware of the danger his sister-in-law was in, dropped everything to come to her rescue, and a now heavily pregnant Margaret bid farewell to her marital home in mid-November, accompanying Jasper through cold winter winds to arrive at Pembroke Castle, where, on the 28th of January 1457, after a brutal and exhausting labour, she gave birth to Henry, and thus began an unbreakable bond between mother and son, one that was to overcome the greatest of trials and tribulations, but was to be equally bolstered by glorious triumphs, and although Margaret had survived the ordeal of childbirth, it is likely that the internal damage she suffered that day meant she could never have children again, for Henry remained her one and only child. Margaret now underwent the traditional ritual known as churching, whereby the mother was to spend 5 weeks with her newborn away from men, and after finishing this period with a ceremony of purification that allowed her to re-enter society, it was Jasper who would lead the search for Margaret's next husband, which commenced in March 1457 with a journey from Newport to Gwent. At the time, being a young, unmarried heiress of extraordinary wealth, Margaret was considered a very eligible match, and with Jasper ever eager to strengthen the House of Lancaster, he decided it was best to give her hand in marriage to one of his loyal supporters, settling on the son of Humphrey Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford. However, during marriage negotiations, which did not require the women to be present, Margaret, empowered by a powerful impetus to safeguard her young son's interests, showed a remarkable degree of involvement, despite being just 13 years old, opting to accompany Jasper to Buckingham's estate at Greenfield in Newport, a journey of more than 100 miles, that, even though this was only 2 months after she had given birth, she was willing to make. Despite Henry Stafford's mother being the granddaughter of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, making him closely related to Margaret, a dispensation was granted by the Pope on the 6th of April 1457, and after Margaret had completed the customary year of mourning for her deceased husband, the couple married on the 3rd of January 1458, marking the start of a relationship quite at odds with the loveless political unions of the time, for it seemed Margaret and Stafford developed genuine feelings for each other, illustrated by the fact that they regularly celebrated their marriage anniversary every year thereafter with sumptuous feasts. On the other hand, only 5 days later, on the 8th of January, the joy of Margaret's wedding would be contrasted with the news that her son Henry was to become the joint ward of Jasper Tudor and the King's treasurer, the Earl of Shrewsbury, although Henry would stay the majority of the time with Jasper at his castle at Pembroke, where the young prince could be assured of his safety, and where Jasper filled the void left by the death of the youth's father, developing his own unbreakable bond with his nephew, who he treated like his own son. With Margaret assured that Henry was being lovingly cared for by his uncle, Margaret settled back into a life of aristocratic splendour with Henry Stafford at his residence in Bourne, and although the union produced no children, she would live happily alongside her new spouse, but her thoughts would always turn back to her son Henry, who she now saw infrequently, and who, as a child, was often sickly, his frail health worrying Margaret immensely and heightened by the sorrow of their separation. Nevertheless, as Margaret fretted about the health of her infant son while tirelessly proving herself as a devoted wife, political developments remained ominous, and despite King Henry VI's effort to mend the deepening divide of the Yorkist and Lancastrian folds at a ceremony known as Love Day on the 24th of March 1457, in which the Duke of York symbolically followed in the steps of Henry and his Queen for the realm to see, tensions continued to rise, culminating in a major Lancastrian defeat at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July 1460, resulting in the capture of King Henry VI by the Duke of York, who forced Henry to name him heir to the throne, and also the death of Margaret's father-in-law and head of her husband's house, the Duke of Buckingham. Consequently, Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, and on the 30th of December 1460, after being provided with an army by Mary of Gueldres, and with a group of vengeful English nobles at her back, achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Wakefield, resulting in the deaths of the Duke of York and his 17-year-old son Edmund, Earl of Rutland. Yet Margaret and her family's jubilation was to be short-lived, coming to a sudden end after York's eldest surviving son Edward defeated Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March 1461, and with Henry VI and his Queen taking flight to France, the resurgent Yorkist rebel crowned himself Edward IV, a moment of utter devastation for Margaret, for now she believed her very life and the life of her beloved Lancastrian son were in the gravest danger they had ever faced. However, luckily for Margaret, it quickly became clear that Edward was not out for blood, and in an attempt to patch the realm up, the king was exceedingly forgiving of his enemies, on the 25th of June 1461 issuing a pardon to the family of Henry Stafford and to his younger brother John, who had fought against Edward at Towton, an act of clemency perhaps made a lot easier given that Henry Stafford was the cousin of the new king, as their mothers were both sisters. On the other hand, despite Margaret's inheritance and titles being relatively unaffected by the Yorkist changeover, Jasper Tudor was branded a traitor, and as a result, the wardship of Henry, now 5 years old, was entrusted instead to one of his own henchmen, William Herbert, the same man who had captured his father Edmund at Carmarthen, who, to help further his cause, paid the king £1,000, around £643,000 in today's money, for the honour of being Henry's guardian, resulting in Henry moving across Wales from Pembroke to his new home at Raglan Castle. Like before, Margaret would endeavour to maintain as much contact as possible by frequently sending her son letters, who, for the first time, would be able to mix with other children of noble stock at Raglan, as William Herbert, and in particular his wife Anne Devereux, took a serious interest in the well-being of their young charge, providing him with great comfort and support, something the young Henry would never forget even as king, when he later welcomed Anne Devereux to his court with open arms. Yet, even though Henry was treated gracefully by Edward, to Margaret's anger, this did not stop the new king from disinheriting many of his lands and giving them to his brother George, Duke of Clarence. And although Henry had been stripped of his title, his mother would still refer to him as Lord Richmond, ever hopeful she could return to him his birthright. For now, the best course of action was to reconcile with the House of York, and, alongside her husband Henry Stafford, proved herself a skillful political manoeuvrer throughout the 1460s, able to work her way into the good graces of Edward's regime at the same time as disassociating herself with the traitorous actions of some of her family members, such as the Duke of Somerset, who, in 1463, deserted Henry VI for the Yorkists, but after gaining great favour from Edward, betrayed him by switching his allegiance back to Lancaster, and was captured and executed on the battlefield on the 15th of May 1464, after being defeated by Edward's armies at the Battle of Hexham. In addition, with the later capture of King Henry VI in Lancashire in July 1465, and his subsequent imprisonment in the Tower of London for 5 years, it was more crucial than ever for Margaret to gain the favour of Edward, which, by December 1466, after Edward granted her the previously confiscated Beaufort Manor at Woking, which had belonged to her disgraced father, she had seemingly won, and for the next few years with Stafford she would live a carefree existence in the Surrey countryside, visiting the local church of St. Peter, going on day trips to local towns such as Guildford for household supplies, and where she even tried her hand at hunting and hawking. Despite her idyllic living situation and her increasing closeness with Stafford's family, whose mother and brother John became close companions, as well as her many trips to another of her childhood homes, Maxey Castle, to see her own mother Margaret Beauchamp, such as at Christmas 1466, when, alongside her half-sister Elizabeth St. John, she spent 6 weeks there, Margaret was always concerned about Henry, and in September 1467 she would make the journey to Raglan Castle to visit him for a week, perhaps for the first time in many years, for it was the first recorded visit in Stafford's accounts, and it was likely that the trip was far too short for Margaret and tinged with jealousy for William Herbert and his wife, a couple who Margaret had no strong affinity for, but who had been given the privilege of raising her son, something that Margaret doubtlessly longed to do herself. Nevertheless, to realize her dream of getting her son back, Margaret would again have to play politics, and in December 1468 she made enormous preparations to receive the king himself, buying for herself a luxurious red dress for the occasion, and sparing no expense as she splashed out on an enormous 5-course meal, complete with an assortment of the finest seafood, an exuberant purple hunting tent, and the most talented musicians in the land, in a visit aimed at determining her loyalty to the Yorkist regime, as a rift between Edward and one of his most important allies, the Earl of Warwick, was steadily growing, with many appalled at Edward's choice of Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of low noble stock, who Edward had married, quite controversially, for love. Yet Margaret's fealty to Edward, however necessary, would once again land her son in great peril, for her son Henry, accompanying his guardian William Herbert, became involved in the ensuing conflict between the king and the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Edgecote on the 24th of July 1469, a crushing defeat for the Yorkist faction that led to the capture and execution of William Herbert, and when news of the outcome came to Margaret, she feared for her son's life, spending an inordinate amount of money to find out if he had been struck down like his guardian. But, to her relief, Henry had indeed survived, and had been whisked far away to Webley Castle in the care of Anne Devereux, and with Henry VI seemingly in the ascendancy, and William Herbert deceased, Margaret pounced on the opportunity to reclaim custody of her son and his birthright in a visit to London on the 24th of August, but to no avail. When the realm was resettled on the 3rd of October 1470 and Henry VI was reinstated, Margaret's luck turned for the better when she was finally given the opportunity to meet Henry again, this time in the company of the king himself, keen to meet the progeny of his greatly missed half-brother Edmund, who granted them an audience at Westminster on the 27th of October. And although it was decided that Henry was to resume being Jasper's ward, it was also proclaimed that Henry should spend some quality time with his mother beforehand. Margaret was elated, and in the next month, November, she would spend 2 weeks with her teenage son, who accompanied them to Woking, where she entertained him with a tour of the Surrey countryside, and where most likely the bond between mother and son was reinforced even further. But before long, Margaret would be heartbroken again as Henry left her company to join Jasper on the 11th of November, a grief that would be intensified, for unbeknownst to both, the next time they would meet would be 15 years later, as Edward IV bounced violently back onto the scene. On the 11th of April 1471, Edward, who was popular in the capital, marched on London to great fanfare, declaring himself king and imprisoning Henry in the Tower of London. And on the 4th of May he went on to defeat a rescue force sent by Henry's wife Queen Margaret at the Battle of Tewkesbury, brutally slaughtering the young heir to the throne, Edward of Westminster, before banishing Queen Margaret back to France and murdering King Henry VI on the 21st of May, an unexpected turn of events that had profound consequences on the standing of the young Henry Tudor. Margaret did not openly grieve the deaths of her Lancastrian kinsmen, for now, with the extinction of the Beaufort male bloodline, the crown was passed on to the female line, of which Margaret was the oldest and, by extension, her son Henry. At her urging, Henry and Jasper fled the country in October, and after entering the North Sea, strong winds diverted their path to Brittany, where they were received graciously by Duke Francis II as noble captives. But Margaret's misfortunes were not at an end, as on the 2nd of October 1471, her husband Henry Stafford, who had been injured fighting for Edward's cause at the Battle of Barnet, succumbed to his injuries, and in a testament to the love and respect he had for his wife's abilities, he named her the principal executor of his will, and most of his earthly possessions he bequeathed to my beloved wife Margaret, Countess of Richmond. In the meantime, being the mother of a potential rival to Edward IV, Margaret found herself in an incredibly precarious position, and in order to improve her standing, she opted for a pragmatic marriage with pro-Yorkist Thomas Stanley, the steward of the king's household, and while Margaret benefited from the closer proximity to the Yorkist fold, Stanley profited from the sizable inheritance his marriage to her entailed. a union of convenience cemented by a wedding ceremony that took place on the 12th of June 1472. But despite Margaret's essential political shift, she was also looking out for her son, placing some of her own ancestral lands in Devon and Somerset in a trust on the 2nd of June 1472 for Henry to claim in the event that he returned. Margaret, however, was not content with living life on the sidelines, and with her powerful new husband, an influential landowner with possessions in Cheshire, Lancashire and northern Wales, where he exercised considerable local heft, began making her mark on high society and allaying Edward's suspicions about her, accompanying Stanley to his manors in Latham and Knowsley, settling land disputes in Liverpool in 1473 and 1474, where, in one particular case, she acted as one of the main judges, all the while becoming an influential presence at the royal court, where, in 1476, she accompanied the Queen and her daughters for the reburial ceremony at Fotheringhay of Richard, Duke of York. Despite her newfound popularity at the Yorkist court, Margaret maintained secret communications with her vagabond son, urging him not to return to England and to regard Edward's pledges with suspicion, for the Yorkist king was trying to lure Henry back to England with promises of wealth, titles, and even marriage to his own daughter, which were no doubt insincere and would only lead to the young prince's death. It was clear that Henry deeply respected his mother's counsel, for in November 1476, after Francis II agreed to return Henry to Edward on the condition he was treated respectfully, Henry, faking illness, managed to escape the clutches of the English envoys sent to apprehend him by taking refuge in a church. And after Henry's pursuers were driven off by townsfolk offended that they would breach the sanctuary of God, Francis was then persuaded to rescind his offer. Yet, despite her son's close call, Margaret continued to bend the knee to Edward, and by 1480, after being entrusted with carrying Edward's youngest daughter Bridget to the font where she was to be christened, it was clear that Margaret had improved her position considerably, and as she rose through the Yorkist ranks, she started to entertain the possibility that she could negotiate Henry's safe return. By June 1482, after the death of her beloved mother Margaret, she finally produced some tangible results, agreeing with Edward that Henry was to be permitted to receive a portion of his grandmother's inheritance, an arrangement marked by the king's stamp on a document dated the 3rd of June 1482, in which it was proclaimed that if Henry were to return, that he would be in the grace and favour of the King's Highness. But with the stage set for Henry's return, Margaret's dreams would be crushed again with the unexpected death of Edward on the 9th of April, and with the agreement yet to be finalized, Henry's fate became uncertain once more. The English crown was now usurped by Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who, like many, had always despised the lowly origins of Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, who now fought to prevent Richard from involving himself in the affairs of government and to make sure that the kingship smoothly transitioned to her son, Edward V. Yet her plans soon disintegrated after Richard, in combination with the Duke of Buckingham, the grandson of Margaret's ex-father-in-law, who had his own gripe with Elizabeth, since he had been forced against his will to marry her low-born sister, intercepted the 12-year-old Edward V at Northampton, and, While the Queen and the rest of her children took refuge at Westminster Abbey, Edward and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were instead sent to the Tower of London, where their claim was deemed illegitimate by Richard, who crowned himself king on the 6th of July, 1482. With Margaret's husband briefly arrested, and Richard illustrating he would stop at nothing to eliminate all those who opposed him after the brutal beheading of Lord Hastings, one of Edward IV's most trusted counsellors, Thomas Stanley was left with no choice but to indicate his support for Richard, and although Margaret attended the coronation banquet, deep down she resented her new king for ruining the arrangement that would finally have seen Henry returned to her. Always thinking of what was best for her son, Margaret may have been involved in a failed plot to rescue the incarcerated princes from the Tower of London, as it is likely she thought that Henry would be more favourably received if Edward V, a young princeling of 12 years old, was on the throne. However, this was not to be, as although no one knows for certain, the most widely accepted version of events is that Richard, realizing that the security of his position would always be threatened by the princes, ordered them to be murdered. But whatever their fate, they were never seen again. With the disappearance of the young princes, and with the popularity of the usurper Richard III, who proclaimed his own son Edward as his heir, dwindling as a result of the widespread rumour that he had sanctioned the killings of his own nephews, Margaret's dedication to her son took on a whole new dimension, as now it was her mission to make Henry, with his pure Lancastrian blood, the King of England. Yet first she would have to legitimize his claim, as Henry was unknown to many people, having spent a large portion of his life in exile. First, Margaret would have to arrange a marriage that would further validate his claim in the eyes of the people, and so began negotiations with the family of the deposed Queen Elizabeth, the Woodvilles, whose daughter Elizabeth of York was the perfect candidate. For since the deaths of her brothers in captivity, many in the realm believed her to be the rightful heir to the throne. With the Woodvilles being heavily guarded at Westminster Abbey by Richard's men, Margaret employed the help of her trusted Welsh physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, who, entrusted with the marriage proposal, was able to pass through to Queen Elizabeth on the pretext that he was seeing a patient, and, without arousing the suspicion of the men outside, he was able to deliver Margaret's message, which Elizabeth, stricken with grief for the disappearance of her two sons, and offered a chance to exact revenge on their murderer, firmly agreed to. With the conspiracy set in motion, Margaret became its architect, enlisting the support of many of Edward IV's former henchmen, including Giles Daubeny, Richard Guildford, Thomas Ramney, John Cheney, and, most significantly, the Duke of Buckingham, the man who had originally conspired with Richard to place him on the throne, but who now, regretting his involvement, especially in the light of the young prince's demise, was willing to change allegiance. And as Margaret stepped up recruitment, she informed Henry of her plan, assuring him that if he were to sail to Wales, then he would find support waiting for him there. However, by the 11th of October, King Richard had cottoned on to the conspiracy, and initially believing that the Duke of Buckingham was the mastermind, he had him immediately outlawed as the Duke rose up in Wales on the 18th of October as planned. Yet heavy rain prevented them from entering England across the River Severn, and soon the Duke was on the run from royal authorities as Henry, unaware of developments, landed in England a few days later, but turned back after growing suspicious of the claims that the Duke's uprising had been a success. The whole enterprise was a disaster, and, with the Woodvilles uprising in Kent, was also put down at the same time. Following the capture and decapitation of the Duke of Buckingham at Salisbury Market-place on the 2nd of November, Richard became aware of Margaret's involvement in the plot, and suddenly she was at his mercy, and her life was only spared because the king, aware that he was deeply unpopular, realized he needed the support of her husband Stanley as a counterbalance to ensure his own political survival. But despite Margaret's miraculous escape, Richard was able to dish out reprisals for her treachery in other ways, and in a devastating blow to her prestige, declared that all of her lands, which she had sought to protect and maintain throughout her life, were to be transferred to her husband Stanley, and that for the foreseeable future she was to remain under house arrest, with her husband as her jailer. But even though Margaret was locked up, she was still able to smuggle messages, probably with the knowledge of Stanley, out to Henry, who, during her incarceration, was busy drumming up support for a second invasion at the same time as avoiding Richard's efforts to apprehend him. As, with Duke Francis's health failing him, his treasurer, Pierre Landois, proved more susceptible to Richard's bribes, compelling Henry and his uncle Jasper Tudor to flee Brittany and to disguise himself as a commoner in order to seek asylum with the King of France, Charles VIII, at the time a 13-year-old boy, whose sister and Queen Regent, Anne de Beaujeu, luckily accepted him. Richard III was not so fortunate, as his own son Edward had suddenly died on the 9th of April 1484, and with his queen Anne unable to bear more children, rumours began to emerge that, to the alarm of Margaret, Richard was planning to marry Henry's betrothed, Elizabeth of York, whose beauty had started to become noted by the courtiers and nobles of the realm, adding a real sense of urgency as Henry organized his second attack. As Richard prepared his army and set up his headquarters in Nottingham for the coming invasion, he also took care to mount a scathing propaganda campaign against Henry, and it was here that Margaret's checkered family history came back to haunt her, as, in a bid to delegitimize his rival Richard, he made sure to point out that her great-grandfather, John of Gaunt, had committed double adultery, and that as a result, Henry's claim to the throne, predicated on an untainted connection to the royal bloodline, was invalid. With Margaret communicating with her son every step of the way, Henry, with a 3,000-strong force at his back, which he was hoping would increase once he was in Britain, set off from Harfleur on the 1st of August 1485, and on the 7th of August he disembarked at Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire on the Welsh coast, marching through Wales unopposed before setting up camp at Merivale Abbey, where, in the evening of the 21st of August, Henry was joined by his loyal followers, including John Wells, Margaret's half-brother. The next day, on the 22nd of August, both armies met at Market Bosworth, but with Richard, the more experienced battle commander and possessing 3 times as many men, Margaret would doubtlessly have been worried about the outcome of the battle, for, in contrast, Henry had no battlefield experience, but as battle commenced, it was Margaret's own husband Stanley who betrayed Richard and turned the tide in Henry's favour, and Richard was struck down as his horse slipped at the edge of a bog. To great fanfare, Henry entered Leicester, and to shouts of "God save King Henry," passed the first decree of his reign, informing the public that Richard was dead and that the men who fought the battle could all return back home, while Margaret penned the auspicious news in her Book of Hours, simply writing, "This day King Henry VII won the field, where was slain King Richard III." Following Henry's triumph at the Battle of Bosworth, it is reported that upon hearing the news of her son's victory, that Margaret started sobbing uncontrollably in the belief that such a great success was bound to be followed up with a disaster. But luckily, her fears were mistaken, for instead the coronation ceremony of King Henry VII went ahead without issue on the 30th of October 1485, and it would be his faithful uncle Jasper who was bestowed the ultimate honour of carrying St. Edward's crown up the aisle of Westminster Abbey. It was the culmination of Henry's first few weeks of office, a period of time he chose not to spend in London, but instead in a clear sign of his affection with his mother at their ancestral home in Woking, where, as a teenager, he had spent a joyful 2 weeks with his mother before his exile, and a place that would always be dear to his heart. And throughout his reign, Henry would show himself eternally grateful for the tireless support of his mother, writing in a letter to her, "I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire it, and I know well that I am as much bounden to do so as any creature living for the great and singular motherly love and affection that it hath pleased you at all times to bear towards me." And indeed, convening his first Parliament on the 7th of November 1485, Henry gave everything to his mother, proclaiming her to be a femme sole, a woman who did not require her husband's consent and was solely responsible for all of her business affairs, at a stroke making Margaret one of the most powerful women in England. And as an illustration of the implicit trust he had for his mother, Margaret was lavished with further honours and responsibilities, including the wardship of the young Duke of Buckingham on the 3rd of August 1486, whose father had sadly perished in Margaret's first unsuccessful attempt to bring down Richard III. Margaret was further honoured by her son in 1477, when she was allocated all of the estates formerly belonging to Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, including Coldharbour Mansion on the Thames, which she made her principal residence alongside more estates in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, and Kendal. And at Christmas 1477, she was given robes and a circlet matching those of a queen, and as the leading female figure of the reign, whose power was greater than even that of her daughter-in-law Elizabeth of York, she also assumed the title of My Lady the King's Mother. Margaret relished her new standing, using her income to become a great patron of the arts. Her first major achievement in this area occurring in 1489, when she commissioned a translation of the French romance Blanchardin and Égalatin, with the help of writer, diplomat, printer, and translator William Caxton. And by 1494, her reputation as a lover of literature was so renowned that Wynkyn de Worde, the editor of a reissued version of Scale of Perfection, a religious work originally written by Walter Hilton, dedicated the entire volume to her. Margaret herself was an expert translator of religious works, setting aside an enormous portion of her waking hours to the translation of the Mirror of Gold for the Sinful Soul from French, as well as the fourth book of The Imitation of Christ, published originally by Thomas à Kempis and released in 1504 and 1506, which became the standard translated edition until it was replaced by another in 1531. In addition to promoting the best literary works of her day, Margaret's personal chapel, overseen by 34 members of staff, almost equal in size to the King's Chapel, became an important centre for the innovation of polyphonic music, and the same site where Margaret practised as a committed Christian, a quality that was even recognised by the Pope in 1494, when he proclaimed her as a paragon of the Church for her ceaseless promotion of the feast of the name of Jesus. Although Margaret was a devout woman of God, she was also brutally practical, and could be particularly cutthroat in her property dealings, as was the case in 1492, when she advanced her own claim on lands situated in Wiltshire and Somerset as heiress of her great-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, whose original philanthropic intentions to use them to fund the Hospice of St. Cross in Winchester was ignored by Margaret, who, upon acquiring them, also disinherited Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick and Salisbury, in the process. On the other hand, Margaret could be equally as generous on occasion, and evidence suggests she was highly concerned with the welfare of her Lincolnshire tenants, to which she was a popular landlord, promoting and funding many developments in the area, including the building of a tidal sluice in the town of Boston and the establishment of a royal commission that worked to make the River Witham more navigable. Although Margaret always kept herself busy, she always reserved time for her grandchildren and always generously gave them many gifts. To her grandsons, Prince Edward and Henry, she bought many fine clothes and books, including a copy of Cicero's De Officiliis to Edward in 1495, and to her granddaughter, Princess Margaret, she sent precious jewellery and brooches on many occasions, also being a proud godmother to her alongside the youngest, Prince Edmund. She was also heavily involved in the marriage arrangements of her grandson, Arthur, Prince of Wales, to Catherine of Aragon, before his tragic death in 1502, requesting in 1498 that the young Spanish princess learn French to communicate, and also to accustom herself to drinking wine, as the water in England was not drinkable, before she entered the royal court, and, in an indication that she liked to know everything about a newcomer entering her beloved family, she even had a list of Catherine's attendants drawn up. With Arthur and Catherine of Aragon married by proxy in 1499, Margaret eagerly recorded Catherine's arrival to Plymouth in her Book of Hours on the 2nd of October 1501, and she was in attendance for their wedding on the 14th of November, preparing a great celebratory feast at Cold Harbour afterwards, intending to impress her Spanish guests, and on the 5th of July 1503 she would again play the role of gracious hostess by entertaining the entire royal family before her granddaughter Margaret went north to marry James IV of Scotland to become the Queen of the Scots. Later in her life, Margaret changed her main residency from Cold Harbour to Collyweston in Northamptonshire between 1499 to 1506, where she set up a court complete with council house and prison, and was imbued with so much authority that on some occasions she was empowered to speak on behalf of the king, illustrated by a letter she wrote to administrators in Coventry addressing the plight of a wronged citizen, and at other times she was permitted to intervene in cases usually reserved only for ecclesiastical courts, such as a lawsuit concerning John Stokesley, a churchman in line for the prestigious bishopric of London, whose accession was hampered when it was alleged he had committed a plethora of crimes, the most unusual of which involved the baptism of a cat for the purposes of finding a secret treasure, and another involving the Holy Maid of Leominster, whose fantastical claim that she only needed the bread and wine of the Eucharist to survive was quickly found to be patently false. By 1504, Margaret's annual income was over £3,000 a year, allowing her to splash out on the finest jewels and to increase the size of her household to such a degree that it rivaled even the king's. But at the same time, Margaret always took her duties very seriously and made sure that her royal status was always highlighted either through the royal insignia embellished on her surviving Book of Hours, or through her carefully styled signature of Margaret R., which she began to adopt from 1499. Her dedication to the maintenance of the Tudor regime was further seen in her desire to keep up to date with foreign relations, such as when she requested a detailed pamphlet be sent to her concerning the visit of King Philippe of Castile in 1506, or the way in which she tirelessly attempted to strengthen the Tudor position by relentlessly pursuing her family's claim to the lands of Orléans in France, which were, in her mind, wrongfully owned by King Louis XII. She felt so strongly about the matter that in 1502, despite being 52 years old, she undertook the grueling journey to Calais to lodge her grievance. It was also in this phase of her life that Margaret became a major benefactor for the University of Cambridge. A 1503 charter illustrates that she used her considerable wealth to secure funding, while also appointing men from her own household to the most important posts, such as John Fisher, who was made Chancellor of Cambridge, and who accompanied Margaret for the opening of Christ's College in 1506, a now world-famous centre of education whose development was kick-started by Margaret's purchase of the manors of Moulton and Roydon. Another of Margaret's followers, Henry Hornby, made the dean of the chapel, later went on to supervise the progress of St. John's College, built between 1505 and 1509, thanks to a sizable donation from Margaret of £1,625. At New Year 1507, 3 years after the death of her husband Stanley on the 29th of July 1504, Margaret received the news that her son Henry, now 50 years old, had become dangerously ill with quinsy, a bacterial infection of the tonsils, the seriousness of the matter becoming evident after he was unable to eat or drink for 6 days straight, causing Margaret's motherly instincts to kick in, and so determined was she to nurse him back to health that she moved to Richmond Palace to take charge of the king's household, but alongside medical supplies, she also insisted that black material be delivered to her. Such was her fear that Henry would slip into death. But fortunately, by the autumn, and to Margaret's relief, Henry had fully recovered. When the king fell ill once again in 1508, and with the realization that the sickness was persistent, thoughts turned to Henry's successor, the future Henry VIII, a popular figure at court who had turned 16 years old in June 1507, and a grandson that Margaret doted on, and had that month given him his first ever saddle and harness to celebrate his first joust. But the young prince found he would have to adapt to kingly life quicker than he thought in February 1509, when Henry VII once again was struck down by pestilence, this time tuberculosis. Margaret again rushed to Richmond, and ready to stay there as long as possible arranged for all of her belongings, including even her favourite bed, to be transported. But Margaret and all who attended the dying monarch realized at once that the diagnosis was grave, as, according to one source, all that stood about him scarcely might contain them from tears and weeping. And on the 21st of April, after taking his last Mass, Henry VII died later that day, leaving Margaret absolutely heartbroken. Now it was up to Margaret, who was placed at the top of the king's executors on his will, and who was herself experiencing ailing health, to arrange a proper send-off for her son, whose body was first embalmed and then moved from the Privy Chamber to the Great Chamber of Richmond, where he lay for 3 days to the sounds of daily dirges and masses, before being transferred to the Great Hall and then the chapel for 3 days each. Finally, his coffin was carried from Richmond to St. Paul's, where, after a moving sermon and mass overseen by Bishop Fisher on the 10th of May, he was then interred in his tomb at Westminster the next day, his household staff throwing in their staves of office in the grave before leaving to celebrate Henry's life in a great feast afterwards. With her dear son laid to rest, Margaret did not let grief nor ill health get in the way of preparing the way for her grandson's accession. In the interregnum, she was recognized by all as the unofficial queen and used her authority to make sure that Henry was surrounded by the right people when he finally took office, which involved reaffirming the loyalties of the men who had served her son well, such as John Fisher, Charles Somerset, Margaret's illegitimate cousin, and Richard Fox, the Bishop of Winchester, as well as removing some corrupting influences from the royal household, such as Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, Henry's much reviled tax collectors, the latter of which Margaret had a personal grudge against after he acted unfaithfully in a previous property deal, and both of whom were arrested and then executed. When the young Henry VIII married the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon on the 11th of June 1509, it was unclear whether his grandmother herself was in attendance, as she was becoming increasingly frail, something that Margaret herself was very aware of, and after turning 66 years old in May, one chronicler noted how she feared that if she was to live longer, her body daily should have waxen more unwieldy, her sight should have been darked, and her hearing should have dulled more and more. Her legs should have failed her by and by, and all the other parts of her body waxed more creased every day, which things should have been matter to her of great discomfort. Despite despairing of her own physical condition, Margaret was able to hold on just long enough to attend the joint coronation of Henry and his new bride Catherine on the 24th of June, a grandiose affair in which the royal couple walked the streets of London to great aplomb, in the same finery that Henry's father and his first wife Elizabeth of York had worn for their special day a generation earlier, with their new subjects cheering and applauding, they made their way from the Tower of London to Westminster for the ceremony, a procession in which Margaret, wearing a black bonnet and a dress made out of velvet, satin and silk, watched from the comfort of a private residence in Cheapside she had bought specially for the occasion. At Westminster Abbey she opted to be similarly low-key, tucking herself away in a private viewing chamber while she observed the coronation service, overseen by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and in the same manner as she had done when she had first heard the news that her son Henry had triumphed over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, she cried for the difficulties that were bound to follow in the wake of such a happy and momentous occasion. Although she made a public appearance at the great feast that followed after, she did not take part in the entertainments afterwards, instead making her peace with God and removing herself to the abbot's house in Westminster Abbey, where she awaited her death. By then, Margaret had been deteriorating for some time, suggesting that it was a bout of food poisoning that finally took her over the edge, for by the 28th of June, on Henry's 18th birthday, Margaret was on her deathbed, having done everything in her power to ensure that Henry was properly prepared for kingship. And the next day, on the 29th of June, 1509, according to a witness who was by her side, the bishop said Mass before her, and as he lift up the precious host, this worthy lady expired. And so, as she had honoured the blessed sacrament, even so the last thing that ever she saw, as I do think, was God. It was a fitting end for a woman who had spent so much of her time an ardent worshipper of the Christian faith, and as she ascended to heaven, her widower firmly believed that she is now joyful in that celestial court of heaven, where she shall be in eternal felicity for ever. Being an extremely wealthy heiress at a young age, Margaret would become embroiled in the political affairs of the realm through no choice of her own, her loyalties to the Lancastrian fold predetermined by the men who early on ran her life and dictated her future. As in her formative years after the death of her father, when, as a 1-year-old baby, she had no independence of her own, Margaret would prove a useful political pawn for Henry VI to auction off to the highest bidder, and with the added attraction of her royal blood, however tainted, he was easily able to find buyers, the first being William de la Pole, who decided to immediately betroth her to his son John de la Pole. As an oblivious 6-year-old girl, Margaret would become the centre of a scandal that rocked the very foundations of the kingdom after accusations that William de la Pole was using his young charge to make his own beeline for the throne. And just as quickly, Margaret's fate would be determined again by powerful men, taking her down a path that would ultimately put her squarely in the Lancastrian camp during the Wars of the Roses, after it was decided she would marry Edmund Tudor, and from this brief and heartbreaking union would emerge the most important person in her life, Henry, and from the moment she first set eyes on him, she vowed she would do everything in her power to safeguard what was owed to him by birthright, his inheritance. With Edmund dying of the plague, Margaret entered into her second marriage with Henry Stafford, who would be an assuring and loving presence as her son Henry, only a few months old, was taken from her and transferred into the custody of his uncle Jasper Tudor to be raised and protected in Pembroke Castle, Wales. But Although Margaret found it easy enough to settle into a peaceful existence in the Surrey countryside, she constantly thought about her son, keeping in regular communication with him and receiving frequent updates about how he was faring. But with the ousting of King Henry VI in 1461 by Edward IV, Margaret was suddenly struck with fear for her son's safety as the Yorkist clan consolidated their rule of the kingdom. Yet, luckily for her, the new monarch proved magnanimous, and with Jasper Tudor following his half-brother, the king, into exile, Henry's guardianship was allocated instead to Lord William Herbert, where he was treated with love and respect. But with her son still separated from her, Margaret embarked on a new strategy throughout the 1460s, one that involved proving her loyalties to the Yorkists with the aim of preserving Henry's inheritance. By 1470, after Henry was briefly reinstated as king, the future looked bright for Margaret, who was reunited with her cherished son and was able to spend a blissful 2 weeks with the teenager at her Woking manor. Yet Margaret would be left inconsolable once again after Edward IV returned to the throne and Henry was forced to flee into exile with his uncle Jasper, and throughout the 1470s and early 1480s, a devastating period where smuggled letters were to be her only form of communication with Henry, she knew she would have to win back Edward's good graces all over again if she were ever to see her son granted safe passage back to his homeland. By 1482, with the help of time and calculated political gestures, Margaret had improved her position in the royal fold to such a degree that Edward was willing to allow Henry to return and for him to be legally endowed with property. But Margaret's plans were to be totally ruined with the usurpation of the crown by Richard III, and following the murders of Edward's successors at the Tower of London, Margaret sprung into action determined to place her own son on the throne, and employing her signature political astuteness, arranged the marriage of Elizabeth of York with Henry to further legitimize his claim by joining the houses of York and Lancaster. But with Margaret's first scheme to destroy Richard's regime going terribly wrong, her life only spared by her marriage to her third husband Stanley, whose support the increasingly loathed Richard needed to guarantee his own political survival, Margaret remained undeterred by the house arrest and the confiscation of all her properties that followed, still keeping secretly in touch with Henry, whose defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth finally liberated her from her shackles and reunited her with her son after 15 long and arduous years, and with Henry crowned the King of England, she finally became the arbiter of her own destiny. As the king's mother, Margaret became the most powerful woman in the realm, and with her inheritance and income now assuredly protected by her femme sole status, she began shaping England in her own image, enriching and entrenching the Tudor family into the very fabric of society via her hawkish accumulation of landed estates, setting up her own judicial system in the East Midlands at Northampton, where her sound and respected judgment saw her regularly intervene in normal as well as ecclesiastical courts, using her vast resources to fund the translation of monumental literary works, nursing the intellectual heritage of the realm by heavily investing in Cambridge University, all the while moulding herself into a paragon of faith and making sure to give generous offerings to religious institutions and to diligently follow the rituals and rites of Christianity for her own salvation, a faith that would indeed be tested by the premature deaths of many of her grandchildren, most notably Prince Arthur, but most significantly by the passing of her own son Henry, whose death affected her so immensely that she was barely able to hold on to her own life for much longer thereafter. But, as always, driven by a sense of familial duty, she made it her mission to survive until she was assured of the continuity of the Tudor dynasty, and, after it was confirmed by the coronation of her grandson King Henry VIII, her life's work was seemingly completed, and Margaret, retiring to the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, passed away a mere 2 weeks later, doubtlessly eager to reunite with Henry, for she could not live without him. What do you think of Margaret Beaufort? Do you think she was single-handedly responsible for Henry VII's accession to the throne? And do you think she was a consistently effective political manipulator? Or that her passion for the welfare of her son made her prone to misjudgments? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.